Hey guys, tonight we step into the quiet and restless decade of the 1880s in America. A decade not often remembered with drama, but one that carried a strange weight of transition, when an old rural world of farms and dusty towns still held most lives, while the rising hum of factories, railroads and crowded cities began to reshape the country into something unrecognizable. People looked around and saw both the familiar and the unsettlingly new. Life was steady, but it was also shifting, quietly and irreversibly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretched across the world, coming together in the stillness of night. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan or soft music hum in the background, and allow yourself to drift slowly into the calm rhythm of the past. Tonight we'll explore what life was really like in America in the 1880s, from its quiet farms and dusty frontier trails, to its smoky cities and endless factories. A time of contrasts, of change, of slow but certain transformation. Let's set the scene. The decade of the 1880s in America was neither a sudden upheaval, nor a peaceful stillness. Instead, it existed in the in-between, a slow transition from one way of life into another, where the old rural rhythm still dictated the lives of millions, even as the hum of factories, the smoke of railroads, and the stirrings of new inventions began to take root. To understand what life truly felt like in this period, it is important first to step back and simply observe the landscape of the nation itself, its population, its geography, its scars from the past, and its restless movement toward a future that seemed both promising and uncertain. By 1880, the United States was home to around 50 million people. This was a young nation compared to the centuries-old monarchies of Europe, yet its population had grown quickly, fed by high birth rates and the arrival of millions of immigrants. The census of that year recorded not only the raw numbers of people but also the balance between those living in rural and urban areas. Nearly 3/4 of Americans still lived outside cities, on farms, in villages, or in scattered homesteads across an expansive countryside. Yet in certain corners, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Boston, the crowded pulse of modern urban life was beginning to accelerate. The contrast between these two Americas defined the decade. The geography of the country was vast, stretching from the industrial mills of New England to the cotton fields of the South, and from the established farms of the Midwest to the arid deserts and mountain ranges of the West. The expansion of railroads tied these distant places together more than ever before, but the distances still felt immense. To travel from one coast to the other was no longer impossible, but for many it remained only an imagined journey, one they read about in newspapers, or heard in the tales of returning neighbors. The land itself still dictated much of daily life. Farmers studied the skies, townsfolk endured the harshness of winters, or the swelter of summers, and those who ventured westward encountered landscapes both forbidding and promising, depending on their fortunes. This decade lay only 15 years beyond the Civil War, a conflict that had scarred the land and its people in ways that were still deeply felt. In the South, entire regions bore the weight of destruction, their economies struggling to recover, their social systems reshaped by emancipation, and their daily life marked by both resilience and hardship. In the North, industry had surged during the war years, and by the 1880s, it continued to grow, drawing workers from both rural America and far-off nations. The war's memory lingered everywhere, in monuments erected in small town squares, in veterans who walked with canes or missing limbs, and in the political debates that continued to circle around the meaning of the Union and the place of the freedmen within it. The westward expansion of the United States was still in motion. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened lands to settlers, and by the 1880s, families were still pushing into prairies, valleys, and plains, carving out farms and towns where none had existed before. The railroads had made such movement possible, carrying settlers, goods, and ideas into territories that had been home to Native Americans for centuries. This movement was often described with words of opportunity and progress, but it was equally a story of displacement, as native tribes were forced from their lands, treaties were broken, and reservations became the imposed reality of their lives. The landscape of the nation, therefore, was one of expansion, but also of deep loss. In the cities, a different kind of landscape was forming, one of brick, smoke, and iron. By 1880, New York City's population had climbed to over 1 million, and Chicago, rebuilt from its Great Fire of 1871, was surging upward with new buildings, new industry, and new people arriving daily. Streets filled with horse-drawn carriages, trolleys, and the noise of factories. The skyline remained low compared to the skyscrapers that would later rise, but the first steel-framed structures were beginning to change the shape of cities. This was not yet the America of towering buildings and automobiles, but its outlines were visible in the restless growth of its urban centers. Yet most Americans did not live in these cities. They lived instead in farmhouses surrounded by fields, or in small towns clustered around a church, a school, and perhaps a single general store. In these places, life remained tied to the cycles of planting and harvest, to the rhythm of seasons, and to the simple routines that repeated themselves year after year. The 1880s America was a nation where one could encounter the modern and the traditional side by side. A farmer might still plow his fields with the help of animals, but read by the light of a kerosene lamp about electric lights being strung up in parts of New York. A factory worker might spend long hours in a textile mill, but return home to a tenement where the family prepared food much as their grandparents had done. The coexistence of old and new was not simply a matter of contrast, it was the very texture of life. The population was not only growing, but also shifting. Immigrants poured into America during these years, arriving in waves from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and later from Eastern Europe. In the West, Chinese immigrants faced hostility and exclusion even as they worked in railroads, mines, and laundries. The diversity of the population created both new cultural richness and new tensions. In neighborhoods of New York or Chicago, languages mixed, foods blended, and traditions were carried into the new land, while nativist movements warned against the dangers of change. America in the 1880s was not a melting pot yet, but it was slowly becoming one. To step into this decade is to enter a nation in between worlds, not yet the modern America of the 20th century, but no longer the agrarian republic of its early years. The Civil War lay in the past, but its shadow stretched long. The frontier was still open, but its closing was already in sight. Cities were growing, but rural life still defined the majority. The industrial age was rising, but its promises and perils were only beginning to unfold. This was the landscape of a changing nation, restless, uneven, and filled with the quiet tension of transition. It is here in this shifting ground that we begin our slow journey into the lives of those who lived in America during the 1880s. To understand their struggles, their routines, their hopes, and their fears, we must keep this landscape in mind. A country young but scarred, vast but connected, rooted in old ways, but leaning toward a future of industry, machines, and crowded cities. The United States in the 1880s was a nation that lived in two worlds at once. On one side stood the growing cities, noisy, restless, filled with smoke, and pulsing with the arrival of new immigrants, the building of railroads, and the opening of factories. On the other stood the countryside, vast, quiet, and rooted in rhythms of planting, harvest, and family labor, where traditions of the past still held strong, and where most Americans continued to live their daily lives. To move through America at this time was to shift constantly between these worlds: the crowded tenements of New York, the broad cornfields of Iowa, the bustling stockyards of Chicago, and the quiet wooden barns that dotted the landscape of countless rural counties. By 1880, the U.S. Census showed that about 72% of Americans still lived in rural areas. Farms stretched across the Midwest and South, while smaller villages and towns clustered around courthouses, schoolhouses, and churches. Yet the cities were growing with an energy that seemed unstoppable. In 1880, New York City had a population of 1.2 million, making it by far the largest in the country. Chicago, rebuilt after its devastating fire of 1871, already counted over 500,000 residents, and would double again by the turn of the century. Boston, Philadelphia, and St. Louis were also thriving centers, their docks, mills and warehouses drawing thousands of workers each year. The nation had not yet tipped toward an urban majority, but the signs were clear that such a tipping point was approaching. Life in the city was marked by contrasts of its own. On one side were the wealthy, who built townhouses along the avenues, attended the opera, and dined in restaurants that offered oysters, fine wines, and imported delicacies. On the other side were the poor, often immigrants, who crowded into dark tenement apartments, where entire families shared a single room. Streets filled with pushcarts, horses, children at play, and the noise of factory whistles. The smells of coal smoke, unwashed alleys, and food stalls mingled in the air. Cities offered opportunity, jobs, excitement, new experiences, but they also demanded sacrifices of health, privacy, and comfort. For many, the city was both promise and punishment. In Chicago, the railroads and stockyards made the city a hub of trade, connecting farmers of the Midwest with markets across the country. Pigs, cattle, and grain arrived in endless shipments, and the city's slaughterhouses became famous, even infamous for their size and efficiency. Chicago was a city of restless growth, its skyline beginning to experiment with taller steel-framed buildings, though nothing yet like the skyscrapers of the next century. In New York, waves of immigrants poured through Castle Garden, and later Ellis Island, after 1892, bringing with them languages, traditions, and hopes for a new life. They settled into neighborhoods that became Little Italies, Little Germanys, and Little Irelands, forming enclaves where old-world traditions lived on even in the shadow of modern industry. Boston offered a different example of urban life, its cobblestone streets and historic churches sitting side by side with factories and dockyards. The city's older families mingled uneasily with newcomers, and the tension between long-established Yankees and fresh arrivals from Europe colored much of its social fabric. These urban centers were not merely growing in numbers, they were changing the very idea of what it meant to be American, mixing cultures and reshaping identities. Yet while the cities surged forward, the countryside remained the steady anchor of American life. In states like Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Ohio, the majority of families lived by farming. Their days began at sunrise, dictated by the needs of livestock, planting, and fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Houses were modest, barns weathered, and tools often simple. Farming families relied on each other, and neighbors were often separated by miles of fields, making community gatherings in churches or schools vital moments of connection. Life on these farms was difficult. The land was both a provider and a challenge. A good harvest could sustain a family, and even provide a small surplus for sale in the nearest market town. A bad year, whether through drought, pests, or storms, could bring hardship and debt. Mechanization was creeping slowly into the countryside. Reapers, plows, and threshing machines were becoming more common, but many families still relied on animal labor and human endurance. The pace of life was slower than in the cities, but it was not free from hardship. In the South, farming often took the form of sharecropping, where African American families and poor whites worked land owned by others in exchange for a share of the crop. This system often trapped them in cycles of debt and poverty, offering little chance of advancement. For many of these families, the rural world was one of hard work with few rewards, yet it was also the only life available. Despite the hardships, rural communities fostered a sense of continuity and tradition. Families often lived in the same regions for generations, their roots tied to the soil itself. Stories were passed down, customs preserved, and local churches or schools acted as the centers of both education and social life. In contrast, city life was marked by movement. Families might live in one tenement for a few years before moving again, following jobs or better housing. The rural and urban worlds were thus not just physically different, but culturally distinct as well. The contrast between these two Americas was not absolute, however. Railroads connected farm produce to urban markets, and newspapers carried city news to rural homes. Rural children sometimes dreamed of leaving for the city, while urban workers occasionally longed for the quiet of the countryside. The two worlds were tied together, each dependent on the other, yet they remained distinct in character. In the 1880s then, The nation balanced on this divide. Most people still lived in the fields, under the wide sky, with days dictated by nature and labor. But more and more were drawn into the rising tide of urban life, with its factories, its crowded streets, and its endless possibilities. This decade was the moment where both worlds existed side by side, shaping and defining each other. The America of the future, the industrial urban America of the 20th century, was being born in the shadows of factories and the smoke of railroads. Yet the America of the past, the rural agricultural republic, still dominated the land. To live in the 1880s was to feel this tension, to see both worlds stretching before you, and to know that the balance was shifting, slowly but surely. The America of the 1880s was not only a land of internal contrasts between cities and fields, it was also a land of arrival. Ships cut across the Atlantic and Pacific, their decks crowded with men, women and children carrying small bundles, worn suitcases, or little more than their hopes. They came from the towns and villages of Europe, from the crowded streets of Ireland, from the farms of Germany, from the mountains of Italy, and from the struggling regions of Eastern Europe. Others arrived from across the Pacific, from China, seeking work in mines, railroads or small businesses on the western coast. Together they formed what historians often call the Great Wave of Immigration, a tide of humanity that reshaped American life in the 1880s. By the close of that decade, nearly 5.2 million immigrants had entered the United States, making it one of the largest surges in the nation's history up to that point. For the travelers, the journey was not easy. Most crossed the Atlantic in steerage, the lowest and cheapest section of the ships, where cramped bunks, poor ventilation and seasickness made conditions harsh. Days turned into weeks, with passengers surviving on bread, soup and salted meats, while dreaming of the land they hoped to reach. For those who survived the crossing, the first sight of the American coastline brought a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. In New York, the harbor became the symbol of entry. Though Ellis Island would not formally open until 1892, the decade of the 1880s still saw hundreds of thousands entering through Castle Garden, a reception station located at the southern tip of Manhattan. There, officials recorded names, checked documents, and offered guidance, though often with confusion and difficulty. Language barriers created misunderstandings, and immigrants found themselves thrust into a city that spoke in 1,000 different voices. The neighborhoods of New York quickly absorbed the newcomers. The Lower East Side became crowded with Jewish and Italian immigrants, its streets lined with pushcarts selling bread, vegetables, and second-hand clothing. In other parts of the city, German bakeries, Irish pubs, and Polish churches created spaces that felt both foreign and familiar. For those who lived there, the neighborhoods provided a sense of belonging in a strange land, though the living conditions were often harsh. Tenement buildings, hastily constructed and poorly ventilated, became home to entire families packed into single rooms. Narrow alleys, dim hallways, and shared water pumps defined daily existence. Chicago, too, became a magnet for immigrants. Germans, Poles, Czechs, and Swedes settled in its growing neighborhoods, bringing with them their foods, languages, and customs. Churches rang out in different tongues, and newspapers were printed in multiple languages to serve the varied communities. Many of these immigrants found work in the stockyards, in steel mills, or on the railroads. The work was often dangerous and exhausting, but it provided a foothold, a way to survive in a new land. In Boston, the Irish presence was strong, shaped by earlier waves of immigration, but Italians and Eastern Europeans were also arriving in greater numbers. Each group brought both a sense of pride and the burden of prejudice. Established residents often looked at newcomers with suspicion, labeling them as outsiders who threatened jobs, culture, or morality. Yet, despite the tensions, the immigrants built their own communities, often side by side with those who distrusted them, gradually weaving their lives into the fabric of the city. On the West Coast, immigration took a different form. Chinese laborers, many of whom had arrived earlier to build the transcontinental railroads, continued to play a vital role in the economy. They worked in laundries, restaurants, and farms, contributing to the daily life of towns and cities across California. Yet they faced extreme hostility. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first significant law to restrict immigration based on nationality, marked the decade with a shadow of prejudice. Violence against Chinese communities was not uncommon, and exclusion became a defining feature of their experience in America. For many, life was marked by resilience in the face of discrimination, as they carved out spaces where they could survive despite hostility. The cultural mix created by immigration in the 1880s reshaped not only neighborhoods, but also the broader culture of America. Foods once unfamiliar, pasta, sausages, bagels, dumplings, entered local markets. Churches and synagogues rose in cities, serving the spiritual needs of their communities. Festivals, music, and traditions crossed oceans and were reborn in American streets. At the same time, these communities adapted to new surroundings, blending old traditions with the necessities of their new lives. Children often became translators for their parents, navigating schools, shops, and workplaces in English, while maintaining their family's native tongue at home. The arrival of immigrants also fueled the nation's industrial growth. Factories needed labor, railroads needed workers, and farms required hands. Immigrants provided the manpower that kept the gears of industry turning, yet their labor often came at a cost. Wages were low, conditions harsh, and accidents common. The willingness of immigrants to accept such conditions sometimes sparked resentment among native-born workers, who felt their own wages and opportunities threatened. This tension would in later years lead to strikes, protests, and calls for further immigration restrictions. Despite the struggles, the immigrants of the 1880s brought with them a persistence that shaped their communities. They built churches, opened shops, established newspapers, and created support networks. They turned unfamiliar streets into places of belonging, even if only in small corners of large cities. Over time, these immigrant neighborhoods gave rise to some of the most vibrant cultural landscapes in America. To live in America during the 1880s was, for many immigrants, to live between two worlds. The old world lingered in their food, their languages, their prayers, and their memories. The new world demanded adaptation, resilience, and endurance. Some would return to their homelands after years of labor, carrying back small savings and stories of America. Others would remain, their children and grandchildren weaving permanently into the nation's fabric. The story of America in this decade, then, cannot be told without the story of these strangers who became neighbors, who filled the streets of cities with new sounds, and who quietly reshaped the identity of the nation. The great wave of the 1880s was more than numbers on a census page. It was the lived experience of millions who stepped off crowded ships, blinked in the sunlight of a foreign shore, and set about building lives in a land that was both welcoming and unwelcoming at once. It was a story of hardship and hope, prejudice and perseverance, and it was this wave of newcomers that gave the cities of the 1880s their restless, ever-changing energy. The America of the 1880s was a nation that echoed with the sounds of progress, the clang of steel, the whistle of locomotives, the grinding of textile machines, and the rumble of coal carts created a kind of industrial symphony that played across the land. If the countryside still held most of the population, the pulse of the new economy beat in its factories, mines, and railroads. This was the era of the Second Industrial Revolution, a period when technology and capital combined to reshape both the economy and the lives of ordinary people. It was an age of growth, of opportunity, but also of hardship, where the prosperity of a few was built upon the grueling labor of many. Steel was the symbol of this transformation. In cities like Pittsburgh, the mills worked day and night, their furnaces glowing red against the night sky. The Bessemer process, which converted molten pig iron into steel quickly and cheaply, had revolutionized production in the decades before, and by the 1880s, steel was the backbone of industry. It built the rails that stretched across the continent, the bridges that spanned rivers, and the frames of buildings that were beginning to rise taller in cities. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-born industrialist, dominated this world, building an empire on steel that made him one of the wealthiest men of his time. Yet for the workers in his mills, life was measured in shifts that stretched 12 hours or more, 6 days a week, in conditions that blistered the skin and strained the body. Wages were modest, injuries common, and job security uncertain. Coal, too, was essential to the industrial machine. The mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia supplied the fuel that powered locomotives, factories, and homes. To work in a mine in the 1880s was to enter a world of darkness and danger. Men, and often children, descended into narrow shafts where the air was thick with dust, and the risk of collapse or explosion was constant. The work demanded endless strength, hauling, shoveling, and loading, yet paid little. Accidents were frequent, and diseases like black lung slowly claimed many who labored underground. Coal was indispensable to the nation's progress, but for those who extracted it, progress came at a cost of health and years of life. The textile factories of New England offered another vision of industrial labor. The great brick mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, and other towns produced cloth for a growing population. Inside, rows of looms clattered ceaselessly, tended by women and children, whose small hands were thought to be well suited for the delicate work. The noise was overwhelming, the air filled with lint, and the hours long. Breaks were few, wages low, and discipline strict. For many families, children's wages were necessary to make ends meet, and so childhood was shortened, transformed into labor, before adulthood had even arrived. Railroads tied together the steel, coal, and textile industries, forming the great arteries of commerce. By 1880, the United States had over 93,000 miles of track, stretching across the country and binding east to west. The railroads were themselves massive employers, hiring engineers, brakemen, firemen, conductors, and countless laborers who laid track, repaired engines, and loaded freight. The work was dangerous, accidents were frequent, and deaths from derailments, explosions, or simple missteps were part of the job's reality. Yet the railroads offered something few other employers did: steady work that could last through the seasons, connecting a man not just to his local town, but to the larger movement of goods and people across the continent. The factories and mines of the 1880s were marked by a relentless rhythm. Workdays commonly lasted from sunrise to sunset, and in many industries even longer. 6-day weeks were the norm, with Sunday often the only respite spent in church, at home, or catching up on tasks left undone. Safety regulations were minimal or non-existent, and if a worker was injured, there was no guarantee of compensation or assistance. Families depended on every wage, and losing work could mean hunger or eviction. Poverty hovered close around many who labored in the factories of progress. Yet, the industrial world was not without its rewards. For immigrants arriving with little, a job in a mill or a factory offered survival, a way to feed a family, however modestly. Cities swelled with laborers, who despite their exhaustion found ways to build communities, attend church, and carve out spaces of belonging. Ethnic neighborhoods grew around factory districts, where languages and customs remained vibrant even amid the smoke and soot. Work was punishing, but it was also the thread by which millions bound themselves into the fabric of America. For the owners and investors, the story was very different. The 1880s were the height of the Gilded Age, when fortunes were made by men like Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil, and Vanderbilt in railroads. These industrialists were celebrated by some as captains of industry, and condemned by others as robber barons. Their wealth, often displayed in lavish mansions and grand social gatherings, stood in sharp contrast to the modest homes and overcrowded tenements of their workers. The gulf between labor and capital widened in these years, setting the stage for conflicts that would erupt in strikes, protests, and demands for reform. Despite the hardships, workers began to organize. Labor unions, though still small and often fragmented, emerged to voice demands for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The Knights of Labor, founded in the late 1860s, reached its peak in the 1880s, claiming hundreds of thousands of members across industries. Though not always successful, such movements represented the growing awareness among workers that their labor powered the nation's progress, and that they deserved a greater share of its rewards. The struggles of miners, steel workers, and factory hands were thus not just personal battles for survival, but part of a broader story of labor in America. Industrialization in the 1880s was not uniform across the nation. The Northeast and Midwest surged ahead with factories and railroads, while much of the South remained tied to agriculture. Yet, even in rural areas, the influence of industry was felt, in the tools bought at stores, in the trains that carried crops to market, and in the goods that filled homes. The reach of factories extended beyond their walls, shaping the rhythms of daily life across the country. To live in America during this decade was to live in the shadow of industry. The glow of furnaces lit the night skies, the whistle of locomotives echoed across valleys, and the clatter of machines filled the air of growing towns. Progress was undeniable, but it was progress built upon backs bent in labor, upon lungs filled with smoke and dust, and upon lives shortened by accidents and exhaustion. For every mile of steel rail laid, for every ton of coal dug, for every spool of cloth produced, there was a worker who bore the cost. In the calm of hindsight, the 1880s appear as both triumphant and tragic. Triumphant in the sense that the United States emerged as a global industrial power, its cities growing, its technologies advancing, its economy expanding. Tragic in that the cost of this progress fell so heavily upon the many who toiled in anonymity, their lives largely unrecorded, their sacrifices essential yet often overlooked. It was this dual reality that defined the factories of progress, a story of innovation and endurance, wealth and poverty, hope and hardship, all bound together in the clang and smoke of the industrial age. If the factories and railroads of the 1880s gave America its pulse of progress, it was still farming that gave it breath. The majority of Americans in this decade lived not in cities but on farms, scattered across the broad expanse of the countryside. Life for them was measured not in whistles and work shifts, but in the slower, ancient rhythms of the seasons, dictated by soil, sun, and sky. To be a farmer in the 1880s was to rise with the dawn, to work until darkness fell, and to live always under the shadow of weather that could nurture or destroy. The farm itself was both home and livelihood. In the Northeast, farms were smaller, often bounded by stone fences and tilled by families who had worked the same land for generations. In the Midwest, the fields stretched wider, with rows of corn and wheat spreading toward the horizon, their yield tied to the global grain markets that were increasingly connected by railroads. In the South, the end of slavery had reshaped agriculture, but not freed it from hardship, as sharecropping and tenant farming became the dominant systems, leaving many families trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Further west, on the plains, settlers broke new ground in soil that was rich yet unforgiving, where the promise of abundance was tempered by drought, locusts, and isolation. The tools of farming in the 1880s reflected the tension between old ways and new innovations. Wooden plows and horse-drawn wagons were still common, yet steel plows, mechanical reapers, and threshing machines had begun to spread. These inventions, pioneered in earlier decades, allowed farmers to cultivate more land and harvest larger crops than before, but machines also required money, and not every farmer could afford them. Those who did, often took on loans, tying themselves to local banks or merchants, and a poor harvest could quickly turn a season of hope into one of ruin. Farming was thus both empowering and precarious. It gave families independence, but it also left them vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Weather was the constant companion, and the greatest uncertainty. Rain could mean life, and drought could mean disaster. In the 1880s, parts of the Midwest and the Great Plains experienced both cycles of abundance and devastating shortages. A sudden storm could flatten fields, hail could shred crops, and early frosts could cut short harvests. Locusts remained a menace in some regions, darkening skies and stripping fields bare in hours. Families who had labored through spring and summer sometimes saw their work vanish overnight, reduced to empty fields, and the grim task of starting again the following year. Daily life on a farm was shaped by work that never truly ended. At dawn, men and older boys often took to the fields, while women and daughters tended to gardens, chickens and cows, alongside cooking, cleaning, sewing, and preserving food. Chores were constant, animals had to be fed and watered, fences mended, tools repaired, and wood chopped for fuel. Children worked from an early age, carrying water, gathering eggs, or helping with planting and harvest. Schooling was fit around farm duties, with many children walking miles to one-room schoolhouses when the season allowed, but being pulled out during planting or harvest to lend their hands at home. Meals were hearty but plain, shaped by what the farm produced. Cornbread, Beans, pork, potatoes and milk were staples, with fruit and vegetables preserved for the winter months. The labor of producing, preserving and preparing food fell largely to women, who also managed the household economy, making soap, sewing clothes, and stretching resources as far as possible. Social life was sparse but not absent. Church on Sundays, barn raisings or harvest festivals gave farmers brief moments of community, though isolation was often the deeper truth of rural life. Monotony was one of the defining traits of farming. Days followed one another in cycles of repetition, planting, tending, harvesting, storing, and preparing for the next season. Unlike the factory worker, whose shift ended with a whistle, the farmer's work was never fully done. The soil dictated the rhythm, and the soil rarely rested. Yet within this monotony was a sense of stability, the knowledge that the family's livelihood was in its own hands, however precarious those hands might be. Debt haunted many farmers in the 1880s. The rise of railroads tied them into national and international markets, meaning their fortunes rose and fell not only with weather, but also with prices in faraway cities. A bumper crop might sound like good fortune, but when markets were flooded, prices dropped, and farmers earned less. Many took loans to buy seed, tools or machinery, only to find themselves unable to repay when prices fell. Merchants extended credit, but often at high interest, and banks foreclosed on those who could not meet their debts. In the South, sharecroppers and tenant farmers lived almost perpetually in debt, caught in contracts that ensured most of their harvests went to landlords or creditors. Despite these hardships, farming families carved out lives filled with endurance and quiet determination. The farmhouse, often simple and modest, was the center of life. Rooms were small, furnishings few, but warmth was found in the hearth, in family bonds, and in the satisfaction of work honestly done. Children grew up with a sense of responsibility early, and though many left for cities as adults, the memory of the farm shaped their character long after. Religion played a strong role in farming communities, offering not only spiritual comfort, but also a social anchor. Sunday services were a chance to see neighbors, to exchange news, and to reaffirm shared values of hard work, faith, and perseverance. Churches often doubled as schools or community halls, further knitting together rural life. The contrast with city life was stark. While urban workers toiled in crowded factories, farmers labored in open fields. While city dwellers struggled with tenement housing, farmers endured isolation and dependence on the whims of nature. Each life had its struggles, but the farmer's was one of solitude, monotony, and constant toil, bound to the soil in a way that made each year both a gamble and a renewal. In the larger picture, farming in the 1880s was more than just an occupation. It was the backbone of the American economy and identity. Politicians praised the farmer as the foundation of the republic, though in practice, many policies favored industry and railroads. Yet the farmer's life endured, shaping the rhythms of the nation even as cities and factories grew. The image of the independent, self-reliant farmer remained powerful, even as the reality was more complex, filled with debt, hardship, and vulnerability. Looking back, the life of a farmer in the 1880s appears as a paradox. It was simple yet demanding, monotonous yet unpredictable, independent yet dependent on distant forces. It offered stability in its routines but also uncertainty in its risks. For millions of families, it was the only life they knew, a life of labor that tied them intimately to the earth, to the weather, and to the relentless turning of the seasons. In the 1880s, few symbols represented progress more than the railroads. They cut across the land like veins of iron, stitching together distant regions that had once seemed separated by impossible stretches of wilderness, prairie, and mountain. To speak of America in this decade was to speak of a nation bound together not only by ideals and institutions, but by the physical steel tracks that reached deeper into its soil year by year. The railroads became more than a mode of travel. They became the arteries of commerce, migration, and communication, carrying with them both hope and hardship. The decade was one of rapid expansion. By 1880, the United States already had close to 93,000 miles of track, and that figure grew steadily as lines spread westward and branched into smaller towns that once felt cut off from the world. Railroads reached into rural areas where farmers had long depended on local markets and limited wagon transport. Now, grain, cattle, and cotton could be shipped to distant cities, while manufactured goods could be delivered back in return. This new web of iron created connections between producers and consumers that made the nation's economy both more dynamic and more vulnerable, for with opportunity came dependence on distant prices and distant powers. The railroads gave shape to the American landscape. Towns sprang up along tracks, and older settlements that were bypassed often dwindled in importance. Depots became focal points of community life, where people gathered to watch trains arrive, to receive news, and to welcome relatives or strangers from far-off places. The sound of a train whistle, echoing across open plains or winding through valleys, became one of the defining sounds of the age, a reminder that even the most remote locations were no longer entirely isolated. But the influence of railroads extended far beyond convenience. They played a central role in migration and settlement. The Great Plains and the West were open to greater waves of settlers, encouraged by government land acts and by railroad companies themselves, which often owned vast stretches of land granted by the federal government. These companies actively advertised farmland in Europe, luring immigrants to settle near their lines. The railroads thus became not only carriers of goods, but also engines of demographic change, drawing populations into areas that would have been unreachable without their tracks. With the movement of people came the movement of ideas, cultures, and industries. Railroads made it possible for newspapers and mail to travel at unprecedented speeds, for perishable foods to reach new markets through refrigerated cars, and for raw materials like coal, iron, and timber to flow into cities where factories transformed them into finished goods. The pace of life accelerated, not in the sense of daily routines, which remained slow for most, but in the sense of connections, the feeling that the world was shrinking, that a place once distant could suddenly be reached within days rather than weeks. Yet for all their promise, the railroads also carried burdens. Safety was a constant concern. Accidents were frequent, with derailments, collisions, and boiler explosions taking lives with grim regularity. Workers who built and maintained the railroads faced especially dangerous conditions, laboring with picks, shovels, and dynamite to carve paths through mountains, forests, and swamps. Many were immigrants, Irish, Chinese, and others, who endured grueling conditions for low wages and little recognition. The iron web was thus built not only on steel and timber, but also on the sweat and sacrifice of laborers whose names rarely entered the historical record. Monopolies and power also grew along with the rails. A handful of wealthy railroad magnates, often referred to as robber barons, controlled vast networks and wielded influence that reached into politics and government. Men like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt became symbols of the era, their fortunes built on speculation, consolidation, and ruthless competition. Farmers who once welcomed railroads for their access to markets soon found themselves burdened by high freight rates and discriminatory practices, as companies charged more for short hauls than long ones, or gave preferential treatment to large shippers. The anger of rural America simmered in this decade, giving rise to the Granger movement and early calls for regulation. The federal government began to step cautiously into this world of private power. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first federal agency designed to regulate a private industry. The act sought to curb abuses in railroad rates and practices, though in practice it had limited effect at first. Still, its passage reflected the growing recognition that the railroads, while privately owned, had become so essential to the nation that they demanded oversight. The cultural impact of the railroads was subtle but profound. They altered the perception of distance and time. Schedules became standardized as railroads imposed railroad time across regions, eventually leading to the adoption of standardized time zones in 1883. This shift, though practical, also marked a symbolic change in daily life, as local, sun-based timekeeping gave way to a system dictated by the needs of trains and commerce. The very way Americans thought about time and space was reshaped by the rails. Even as they knit the nation together, the railroads also deepened divisions. Native American tribes, already displaced by earlier waves of settlement, saw their remaining lands cut by tracks that brought yet more settlers and more pressure. The bison herds, once central to life on the plains, were hunted nearly to extinction, aided by the ease of transport provided by trains. The iron web was thus both a tool of progress and a harbinger of cultural destruction, carrying not only goods and people, but also the forces of displacement and change that erased older ways of life. For the average American in the 1880s, the railroad was both ordinary and extraordinary. To step onto a train was to enter a world of noise, smoke, and motion, a sharp contrast to the stillness of farms or small towns. For those who never traveled, the train was still a presence, a whistle in the night, a line of smoke on the horizon, a reminder that the world was moving faster than before. It was progress made tangible, both exciting and unsettling, both liberating and binding. By the close of the 1880s, the railroads were not merely a feature of the landscape, they were the skeleton upon which much of American society rested. They carried the harvests of farmers, the ores of miners, the products of factories, and the hopes of immigrants. They generated fortunes and fueled resentment. They made the nation feel smaller, and yet revealed how vast it remained. The web of iron was a triumph of engineering and ambition, but also a mirror of the inequalities and conflicts of the age. Thus, the railroads in the 1880s can be seen as both arteries of life and sources of strain, lifelines that brought opportunity and connection, but also burdens of risk, monopoly, and loss. They were the backbone of America's expansion, but also a reminder that every advance carried costs. The whistle of a train in that decade was both a call to the future and an echo of what was being left behind. If the railroads represented speed, industry, and connection, then the small towns of the 1880s represented continuity, routine, and a kind of stillness that lingered, even as the wider world changed. While cities swelled with new arrivals and factories thundered with machines, the majority of Americans still lived in rural communities and modest towns, where life unfolded in rhythms that had little to do with stock markets or steel mills, and much to do with the slow passage of the seasons, the ring of a church bell, and the hum of everyday tasks. A small town in America during the 1880s was not simply a cluster of buildings, it was an ecosystem of human connection, often centered around a single main street, with its general store, post office, blacksmith shop, and perhaps a modest hotel or boarding house. The town provided just enough services to sustain its residents and the surrounding farmers. The buildings were usually simple wooden structures, sometimes painted but often left weathered, and the roads unpaved, turning to dust in summer and mud in spring rains. Horses, wagons, and the occasional rider passing by were common sights, and while trains might thunder in the distance, within the town itself, life moved at a far slower pace. Churches were central. In many towns, the church steeple was the most prominent structure, visible from the surrounding countryside. On Sundays, families dressed in their best clothes and gathered for worship, a ritual that was as much social as spiritual. The church provided a place for community decisions, for weddings and funerals, and for the rhythms of the year that tied people to one another in ways as binding as kinship. Sermons echoed through wooden pews, but afterward, conversations on porches and in yards often carried as much weight as what had been said from the pulpit. The general store was another anchor of town life. It was rarely large, but it carried everything from dry goods and fabrics to nails, lamp oil, and occasionally a barrel of pickles or candy jars that drew the attention of children. Purchases were often recorded in ledgers, with credit extended until the harvest or payday. The storekeeper knew nearly everyone's business, not because he pried, but because in small towns, information flowed as naturally as air. A package delivered, a letter arriving, and a new tool purchased. Each was a small marker of the rhythms of daily life, and each often sparked conversation that traveled outward into the community. The schoolhouse was typically a single-room structure, standing near the edge of town or amid open fields. Inside, children of varying ages sat at wooden desks, learning arithmetic, spelling, and history under the guidance of one teacher. The blackboard, slates, and chalk provided the tools of instruction, while the lessons were often interrupted by the practical realities of rural life. children absent to help with planting, harvesting, or caring for livestock. Education was valued, but it existed within the framework of survival and necessity, and families understood that school had to bend to the demands of the farm. Still, for many children, the schoolhouse was a place of both learning and companionship, where friendships formed, and where the wider world beyond the town was glimpsed through books and stories. Daily life in a small town was filled with tasks that seemed ordinary at the time, but together formed a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. Women managed households, preparing meals from scratch, washing clothes by hand, and tending gardens that supplemented what could be bought at the store. Men often worked in farming, carpentry, or trades, and those in town might run shops, smithies, or other small enterprises. Children's days were divided between school, chores and play, though play often meant simple games outdoors, using what was at hand rather than toys purchased from afar. The pace of communication was slow, and this too shaped the tone of town life. News arrived by mail, newspaper, or word of mouth, and while national headlines eventually filtered in, what mattered most were local events. Who was sick, who had prospered, who had a new child, or who had lost a relative. These were the stories that traveled from porch to porch and across back fences. Day gossip was not always malicious. It was the fabric of connection, the way people knew they belonged to something larger than themselves. To be spoken of was to be seen, and to be part of the town meant being woven into its constant flow of small stories. Entertainment and leisure reflected the simplicity of the setting. Families might gather on porches in the evening, listening to the chirping of crickets, or the distant whistle of a train. Traveling shows, circuses, or theatre troupes occasionally passed through, providing moments of wonder and diversion. Barn dances and community gatherings offered opportunities for music, laughter, and companionship. These events broke the routine, but did not erase it. Rather, they became highlights in a cycle that otherwise returned, day after day, to familiar patterns of work, worship, and neighborly contact. Yet beneath the calm surface, small towns also carried their tensions. Differences in class, ethnicity, or religion could create divisions, though these were often muted by necessity, as neighbors depended on one another. Disagreements might simmer, but in a community where isolation was always a risk, cooperation usually prevailed. Hardship, whether in the form of crop failures, illness, or accidents, was met collectively, with townspeople offering help and support. In this sense, survival itself demanded a kind of unity, even when personal feelings were complex. The slower pace of small-town life was not simply a matter of limited opportunity, it was also a reflection of distance. While railroads connected towns to cities, travel was still costly, and most residents spent their entire lives within a small radius of home. The wider world existed, but it was experienced through newspapers, stories, or the occasional letter. For most, the town was the universe, a place where life's major milestones unfolded, and where identity was rooted. Birth, marriage, work, and death were not abstractions. They were woven into the soil, the streets, and the relationships of a specific place. By the 1880s, small towns across America shared these characteristics. Whether in the Midwest, New England, or the South, there were regional differences, architectural styles, agricultural patterns, local customs, but the essence remained remarkably similar. Life was steady, communal, and often repetitive, yet it carried a depth of meaning precisely because it was shared. The town was a stage upon which the drama of everyday existence played out, not in sudden acts but in the slow unfolding of generations. To live in a small town in the 1880s was to live within a web of familiarity. It was to recognize faces wherever one went, to mark time not by clocks but by the sun and the seasons, to measure wealth not only in money, but in trust and reputation. It was to inhabit a world where the past was never far away, and where the future seemed to come slowly, arriving by train, or by rumor, but always filtered through the steady, unchanging rhythm of life, as it had always been lived. If small towns of the 1880s carried the calm rhythm of familiarity, the cities represented something very different, an unrelenting density of people, buildings, and struggles packed tightly together, where the pace of life was faster, louder, and far more uncertain. Cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia grew rapidly during this decade, drawing immigrants and rural families alike, all searching for wages and opportunity. But with the growth came crowding, and with the crowding came problems that reshaped the daily existence of millions of people. At the heart of urban life in the 1880s were the tenements. These were narrow, multi-story buildings constructed to house as many families as possible within the smallest possible space. In New York City, entire blocks of neighborhoods such as the Lower East Side were filled with such structures, built quickly and cheaply by landlords who sought profit above comfort. The tenements were often dark, poorly ventilated, and lacking in sanitation. Entire families, sometimes 6 or 8 people, might share a single small room, with thin walls separating them from their neighbors, and little privacy to be found. Windows opened onto narrow air shafts that provided minimal light and no real fresh air. Sanitation was one of the greatest challenges. Toilets were often shared by dozens of people, located in the hallways or in outhouses in crowded courtyards. Clean water was scarce, and waste disposal was haphazard. Garbage collected in the streets, mingling with horse manure, ash, and discarded food scraps. In the heat of summer, the stench could become overwhelming, while in winter, smoke from coal and wood fires thickened the air. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis thrived in such conditions, claiming lives regularly and shaping the fragile sense of survival in these environments. Overcrowding created a sense of compression that was both physical and emotional. Children played in narrow alleys, dodging wagons and pushing through refuse. Clotheslines stretched overhead between buildings, creating canopies of garments swaying above streets that never seemed to rest. The noise of vendors, wagons, and voices in dozens of languages echoed constantly, blending into a ceaseless hum that made silence itself a rarity. For newcomers, especially immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, these neighborhoods were both places of hardship and the first steps toward building new lives. The smoky streets of the city reflected its industrial heart. Factories belched coal smoke into the air, coating buildings in soot and filling lungs with particles that caused chronic illness. Gas lamps lined main thoroughfares, but side streets and alleys remained in darkness, breeding both danger and a sense of hidden life. Streets were uneven, muddy in rain, dusty in summer, and littered with the debris of thousands of people living in tight quarters. Peddlers hawked wares, pushcarts carried food, and horses pulled carriages, contributing to the constant congestion. The smells of cooking, sweat, smoke, and decay all mingled, creating an atmosphere that was as overwhelming as it was unavoidable. Despite the difficulties, the cities also offered opportunities. For many, the crowded tenements were temporary places, stepping stones to something better once a family found its footing. Immigrants often lived among people of their own nationality, forming tight-knit neighborhoods where language, food, and customs provided familiarity. Churches, ethnic clubs, and mutual aid societies offered forms of support that softened the harshness of city life. Yet the climb upward was slow, and generations often passed before a family could leave the overcrowded districts behind. Work in the city was never far from its living spaces. Factories, sweatshops, and small workshops often operated out of the very tenement blocks where people lived. Seamstresses worked long hours stitching garments by dim light. Children were sometimes sent into factories to supplement family income, and men labored in construction, docks, or factories, returning home weary to cramped rooms. The boundary between home and labor was thin, and exhaustion was a constant presence. Reformers of the time began to notice the conditions of city life. Journalists, ministers, and early social workers documented the overcrowding and sanitation crises, calling for new housing laws and better infrastructure. Photographs taken later by Jacob Riis in the 1890s would make these realities widely known, but the conditions already existed in the 1880s, shaping the daily life of millions who endured them in silence. City governments struggled to keep pace, laying sewer lines, paving streets, and building aqueducts, but demand always outstripped supply. For children, city life offered both hardship and a strange kind of freedom. Streets became playgrounds, filled with games improvised from whatever was available. Newspapers were sold by newsboys who shouted headlines into the air, while rag pickers and young workers scoured alleys for scraps to sell. Childhood was short, shaped by necessity, and for many the expectation of work arrived almost as soon as they could walk and carry. The crowded city of the 1880s was not only a physical place, but an atmosphere. It carried with it a constant awareness of other people, their presence, their noise, their struggles, pressing in from every direction. Privacy was scarce, silence rarer still, yet within this density, communities formed, resilience grew, and a kind of urban identity began to take shape. The tenements and smoky streets may have been harsh, but they were also the soil from which modern America's urban life would eventually grow. As the decade continued, the contrast between the small towns and the crowded cities became one of the defining features of the country. One represented continuity and rootedness, the other change and upheaval. And while the small towns shaped the majority of daily American life, the crowded cities captured the imagination and the anxiety of those who looked ahead to the future. The cities, though grim, were alive with energy, ambition and struggle, and they stood as reminders that America was not standing still but moving forward, even if at great cost to those who filled its smoky streets and narrow rooms. In the collective imagination of the 1880s, the western frontier loomed large. It was a space at once real and imagined, a place of opportunity, hardship, violence and reinvention. To those who had grown weary of city smoke or the monotony of eastern fields, the horizon of the West suggested freedom, land, and the possibility of starting over. Yet, the reality of life on the frontier was often far harsher than the myths that would later be told in dime novels and traveling shows. The West in the 1880s was a land of homesteads carved from plains, of railroads pressing steadily onward, of cattle trails stretching across great distances, and of native communities facing the final devastating chapters of their displacement. The Homestead Act of 1862 still shaped life 2 decades later, offering parcels of land to settlers willing to farm and develop them. By the 1880s, thousands of families had traveled westward to claim these homesteads, building sod houses or wooden cabins on the prairies. The promise of free land lured both immigrants and native-born Americans who carried wagons filled with tools, seeds and small possessions into landscapes that were vast and unfamiliar. Yet the reality was often sobering. The soil was hard, the weather unpredictable, and isolation weighed heavily on those who settled miles from their nearest neighbors. Crops were at the mercy of droughts, pests and sudden storms. A homestead might represent opportunity, but it also represented endless labor and the constant risk of failure. The expansion of the frontier came at immense cost to Native American communities. The 1880s were marked by policies designed to confine and assimilate, as the federal government moved forcibly to relocate native peoples onto reservations. Tribes that had once ranged freely across the plains found their movements restricted, their hunting grounds diminished, and their way of life systematically dismantled. The Dawes Act of 1887 further broke apart communal lands, assigning parcels to individuals in an attempt to impose Euro-American notions of farming and ownership. The policy not only stripped tribes of vast amounts of land, but also undermined cultural and communal traditions that had sustained them for centuries. Violence and conflict accompanied this process of displacement. Skirmishes and battles had already scarred the earlier decades, but by the 1880s the balance of power was overwhelmingly tilted toward the expanding United States. Native resistance persisted in places, but the scale of federal military presence made survival increasingly impossible. The frontier of the 1880s, often celebrated in myth, was thus also a space of sorrow, as ancient ways of life were curtailed, and entire communities were forced into a new and often bleak existence. Amid this, the cowboy emerged as one of the most enduring images of the West. In reality, cowboys were working men, many of them young, some of them Mexican vaqueros or African Americans who had been freed from slavery only a generation earlier. They drove cattle along long trails from Texas to railheads in Kansas, enduring long days in the saddle, exposure to heat and storms, and the constant challenge of keeping herds together. The work was monotonous, physically exhausting, and offered little pay, yet it was also work that became central to the economy of the West. as cattle from the open ranges fed the growing cities of the East. The myth of the cowboy, however, grew alongside reality. Popular novels and traveling Wild West shows, such as those organized by Buffalo Bill Cody, transformed the cowboy into a figure of freedom, adventure, and rugged individualism. In these performances, the hardships of cattle drives were replaced with dramatic gunfights, chases, and heroic rescues, presenting audiences with a version of the frontier that was more legend than fact. To city dwellers, the cowboy symbolized a kind of untamed vitality that seemed to contrast with the crowded streets of their own lives. Yet to those who lived the reality, it was simply long hours of labor in uncertain conditions, far removed from the romantic pictures painted on stage. Railroads played a central role in this frontier life. By the 1880s, tracks extended deep into the western territories, carrying settlers, goods, and cattle, while bringing back grain, ore, and hides. Small towns sprang up around depots, their main streets lined with saloons, general stores, and livery stables. These towns were often rough and temporary, springing into being with the arrival of the railroad, and sometimes disappearing just as quickly if resources dried up or routes shifted. For settlers, they offered a connection to markets and supplies, but they also carried the presence of the wider world, drawing the frontier ever closer to the structures of the East. The environment itself remained one of the greatest challenges. The vast plains stretched endlessly, leaving families exposed to winds that blew unbroken for miles. Winters could be brutal, with blizzards cutting off supplies and leaving settlers stranded for weeks. Summers brought heat, drought, and swarms of insects that devoured crops. To endure required persistence, and many families simply gave up, abandoning their claims and returning eastward. Those who remained developed rhythms of survival, learning to rely on neighbors despite distances, and building communities bound together by necessity as much as by choice. The West in the 1880s was thus both a place of struggle and a place of dreams. The promise of land and opportunity drew people in, but the reality of hardship defined their daily lives. At the same time, the frontier represented the closing of an era. By the end of the decade, with railroads spanning the continent and the government steadily organizing territories into states, the so-called frontier was less a wilderness and more an extension of the growing nation. The myth of the West, however, would persist, living on in stories, shows, and eventually films that romanticized the hardships into legends of freedom. For those who actually lived it, the frontier was never just myth. It was sod houses on windswept plains, cattle drives under unrelenting sun, native communities facing forced change, and settlers who staked everything on uncertain land. It was resilience and failure, promise and loss, reality and dream, all intertwined in the daily life of a nation still pushing outward, even as it struggled with the consequences of its expansion. By the 1880s, the story of Native American life had entered a somber and irreversible chapter. The vast landscapes that had once been traveled freely, where hunting, trade, and ceremony had shaped centuries of existence, were now carved into boundaries drawn not by nature, but by federal law. The tribes who had for generations moved with the seasons across plains, deserts, forests, and rivers, now found themselves hemmed in by treaties that were written, signed, and then, more often than not, broken. The frontier was closing, and with its closure came not merely the end of geographical expansion, but the slow and deliberate dismantling of native ways of life. The reservations that dotted the map of the American West in the 1880s were the most visible signs of this transformation. Established through treaties or imposed outright, they were often placed on marginal land, far from the fertile hunting grounds, rivers, or grazing plains that had once sustained entire nations. The government had promised supplies, tools, and support to those relocated, but the deliveries were inconsistent, delayed, or corrupted by intermediaries who profited from the system. Hunger and malnutrition spread, leaving communities dependent on rations of flour, sugar, and salted meat, rather than the fresh game and cultivated crops that had once filled their diets. The loss of land was more than physical, it was cultural. For many tribes, identity was bound to the places they inhabited, the plains that stretched beyond the horizon, the mountains rising against the sky, the rivers that wound their way through valleys. With displacement came the erosion of traditions that required movement, ceremonies tied to specific landscapes, and knowledge passed down through generations of living in balance with the natural world. A way of life built on freedom of movement and seasonal rhythms was compressed into narrow boundaries, and daily routines dictated not by the land but by the government's regulations. The treaties themselves had long been a source of strain. Throughout the 19th century, agreements were made between tribal leaders and the federal government, promising land, sovereignty, or protection in exchange for peace or relocation. Yet as soon as gold, farmland, or railroads appeared within those promised lands, new treaties were demanded or old ones simply ignored. The 1880s were a continuation of this pattern, as political pressure mounted to assimilate native communities into the larger framework of American life. The government's approach shifted away from simple displacement and toward deliberate cultural transformation, aiming to erase the distinctiveness of native societies in favor of Euro-American models of farming, schooling, and religion. The Dawes Act of 1887 epitomized this new phase. By dividing communal land into individual allotments, it sought to impose the European idea of private ownership onto a people who had traditionally understood land as shared, sacred, and inseparable from community. What was presented as an opportunity for self-sufficiency in farming often resulted in the fragmentation of tribal unity, as lands not allotted to individuals were sold to white settlers, shrinking reservations even further. The act was not just about land but about assimilation, forcing native communities into patterns of living alien to their traditions. Boarding schools for native children reinforced this pressure. Institutions such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879, became models for a system that expanded through the 1880s. Children were taken from their families, sometimes by force, and placed in schools where their hair was cut, their languages forbidden, and their traditional clothing replaced with uniforms. The motto of Carlisle, "Kill the Indian, save the man," reflected the stark philosophy driving this education, that survival required abandoning native identity altogether. While some students adapted and found ways to blend the teachings of the schools with their own heritage, many were scarred by the experience, caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. Despite these immense pressures, native communities continued to resist erasure in subtle and profound ways. Ceremonies were carried out in secret, languages were spoken quietly within families, and traditions of storytelling, song and art persisted even as official policies sought to suppress them. In some places, open resistance continued as well, though by the 1880s the power of federal military presence made armed struggle increasingly futile. Still, the memory of conflicts such as the Great Sioux War of the 1870s lingered, and leaders such as Sitting Bull remained symbols of dignity and endurance, even in the face of overwhelming force. The daily life on reservations was marked by monotony, dependence, and the slow weight of change. Farming was encouraged, but often difficult on poor soil. Government agents oversaw supplies and enforced regulations, creating a system in which autonomy was stripped away. Families lived in wooden cabins or simple structures, far removed from the mobility of tipis or the seasonal camps of earlier generations. The rhythm of hunting, gathering, and moving with the herds was replaced by waiting for rations or struggling to coax crops from unyielding ground. For many, this represented not only economic hardship, but also a deep cultural dislocation. The erasure of native life in the 1880s was not complete, though it was deeply wounding. Traditions adapted, languages persisted, and communities endured, even if in altered forms. The stories carried forward by elders became lifelines, preserving identity in the face of relentless pressure to conform. While official policies sought to frame native peoples as relics of the past, their presence continued to shape the reality of the present, reminding the nation that the history of America was inseparable from the histories of those who had first called it home. Thus, the Native American experience of the 1880s was one of loss, transition, and resilience. Land was taken, treaties broken, and ways of life suppressed, but within the boundaries of reservations and boarding schools, within cabins and hidden ceremonies, the threads of tradition continued. It was a time of sorrow and struggle, but also of quiet endurance, as communities found ways, however fragile, to remain themselves in a world determined to make them disappear. The decade of the 1880s sat uneasily between two eras in the history of African Americans. Reconstruction, that brief and fragile experiment in racial equality after the Civil War, had ended in 1877 when federal troops withdrew from the South. The promise of political participation, civil rights, and protection under law had given way to a reality defined by disenfranchisement, economic dependence, and the slow tightening grip of segregation. By the 1880s, African American life in much of the South was shaped not by the freedom envisioned in emancipation, but by new systems of control that sought to preserve as much of the old order as possible under the guise of legality. At the heart of this new reality was sharecropping. When slavery ended, the question of labor remained unresolved. Formerly enslaved people sought independence and land of their own, but most lacked the means to acquire it. Plantation owners, for their part, sought to maintain their workforce without the institution of slavery. Sharecropping emerged as the compromise, though in practice it trapped many African American families in cycles of poverty. Under this system, tenants farmed plots of land in exchange for a share of the crop, usually half, which went to the landowner. The arrangement seemed fair in theory, but in reality it left sharecroppers perpetually indebted. Tools, seed, and supplies were often purchased on credit from local merchants at inflated prices, with repayment tied to harvests that might fail under drought, pests, or fluctuating markets. By the time debts were settled, little remained for the farmer's own use. The monotony of sharecropping was compounded by its lack of autonomy. Families labored under the watchful eyes of landowners or their agents, with little control over what crops were planted or how the land was managed. Cotton dominated the southern economy in the 1880s, and the demand for its cultivation meant that subsistence farming, growing food for one's own table, was often discouraged. Hunger and malnutrition became common in communities already burdened by poverty. For those who had hoped emancipation would bring independence, the reality was a grinding cycle of labor that looked in many ways like a continuation of the old system under another name. Alongside economic control came the rise of legal and social systems designed to enforce racial separation. The 1880s marked the beginnings of what would later be known as the Jim Crow era. Segregation laws spread unevenly across the South, dictating separate facilities in transportation, schools, and public spaces. Though some of these laws were not yet fully entrenched, the social order they represented was already becoming visible. Violence and intimidation were used to enforce boundaries that law alone could not sustain. Lynching, a brutal and public form of racial terror, rose sharply in these years, sending a clear message that African Americans who challenged the racial hierarchy did so at great risk to their lives. Voting rights, which had been briefly exercised during Reconstruction, were steadily stripped away. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and complicated registration procedures served as barriers designed specifically to exclude African American voters. Even before the Supreme Court's infamous 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which would formalize separate but equal, the groundwork was being laid for a system in which African Americans were citizens in name but denied the practical rights of citizenship. Political participation waned, and with it the hope that laws alone might secure equality. Yet within this harsh reality, African American communities built networks of resilience. Churches stood at the center of community life, offering not only spaces of worship, but also meeting places, schools, and centers for mutual aid. The Black Church became one of the few institutions fully controlled by African Americans, and its influence extended into nearly every aspect of daily life. Preachers provided leadership and spiritual guidance, while congregations pooled resources to support widows, orphans, and those in need. In the absence of legal protections, these communal bonds became vital for survival. Education also emerged as a quiet act of resistance. Despite the barriers of underfunding and segregation, African Americans sought schooling for their children, often building and supporting schools themselves when public systems failed them. Teachers, many trained at historically black colleges founded after the Civil War, carried knowledge into rural communities where opportunities were otherwise scarce. The spread of literacy and education, though uneven, represented both a practical tool for advancement and a symbolic rejection of the notion that freedom need be limited. The 1880s also witnessed the first stirrings of migration that would later grow into the Great Migration of the early 20th century. Though numbers remained relatively small at this stage, some African Americans left the South, moving northward to cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York in search of work and greater safety. Others looked westward, joining movements such as the Exodus migration to Kansas, where they hoped to establish farming communities far from the control of Southern landowners. These movements reflected both desperation and determination, a willingness to uproot in the hope of building lives less constrained by racial oppression. Despite these acts of resilience, the weight of oppression remained heavy. Daily life for many African Americans in the South during the 1880s meant endless labor in cotton fields, limited access to education, fear of racial violence, and the denial of basic rights. Dreams of independence were curtailed by debt, while hopes of equality were thwarted by law and custom. Yet the story of African American life in this period cannot be reduced solely to suffering. It was also a story of endurance, creativity, and community, as families and neighborhoods found ways to preserve dignity and meaning in a society determined to deny them both. In this sense, the African American experience of the 1880s mirrored the contradictions of America itself. The nation celebrated progress, industry, and expansion, while simultaneously allowing a large portion of its population to live under conditions that belied the rhetoric of freedom. The promises of Reconstruction had faded, but the foundations of later struggles, the churches, the schools, the networks of mutual support, were already being laid. These would, in time, provide the framework for resistance and civil rights movements yet to come. Thus, the 1880s represented both a low point and a seedbed. Segregation deepened, violence intensified, and poverty persisted, but within the shadow of these realities, communities found strength. It was not the equality envisioned after emancipation, nor the independence hoped for by freed people, but it was life, shaped by hardship, defined by resilience, and carried forward into a future that, though uncertain, remained theirs to claim. In the America of the 1880s, the lives of women unfolded in a landscape shaped by labor, duty, and expectation. Whether in the rural quiet of farmland, the structured rhythm of small towns, or the restless growth of industrial cities, women's daily realities were defined less by choice and more by the obligations imposed by family, society, and economy. Though the voices of women were muted in the public sphere, where politics, property, and law remained firmly in male hands, their presence was constant and essential in sustaining households, communities, and even the nation's growing industrial power. For women in rural areas, where the majority of Americans still lived in the 1880s, daily life was marked by an unending cycle of chores tied to the land and the household. On family farms, women rose early to prepare meals, tend to gardens, churn butter, and preserve food for the winter. Their responsibilities stretched outward into the barnyard, where feeding chickens, milking cows, and assisting with seasonal harvests added to the workload. Children were cared for, clothed in garments often made by hand, and taught the basic skills necessary for life in a household, where self-sufficiency was critical. Laundry, done without machines, meant hauling and heating water, scrubbing garments, and drying them in the open air. The rhythm of rural women's lives was dictated by necessity, each season bringing its own set of tasks, each day filled with labor that was vital, but often invisible outside the family home. In small towns, women's lives were no less demanding, though shaped differently by setting. The general store, the schoolhouse, and the church became anchors in a woman's routine, and their presence there was essential to the maintenance of community ties. Sewing circles, church socials, and local aid societies provided spaces where women gathered, not merely for companionship, but to sustain the social fabric of their towns. Women oversaw the upbringing of children and the management of households, but their labor often extended beyond the domestic sphere into work that supported the family economy. Running a boarding house, taking in laundry, or sewing for neighbors were common ways that women contributed to household income, in an age when their official avenues for employment were narrow and restricted. City life, for women of the working class, presented a different picture altogether. Industrial growth drew many into factories, where women labored long hours for low wages in textile mills, garment shops, and canneries. Tenement housing meant cramped, unsanitary living conditions, where household chores were carried out in shared courtyards or narrow kitchens with little ventilation. For immigrant women in particular, the dual burden of industrial labor and household survival was immense. They rose before dawn to prepare food and care for children, worked 10 or more hours in factories, and returned to households where meals, cleaning and mending still awaited. Middle-class women in cities experienced different constraints, confined largely to domestic duties, but increasingly influenced by new cultural ideals that cast them as moral guardians of the household, responsible for instilling virtue and discipline in children, and for upholding the family's reputation in a rapidly shifting urban environment. Yet even within these heavy routines, women in the 1880s began to assert themselves in new ways. The seeds of activism, sown earlier in the century through movements for temperance and abolition, began to take root in new campaigns for suffrage, labor reform and education. Women's clubs, which appeared in both towns and cities, became important spaces for discussion and organization, where issues ranging from sanitation to child welfare to voting rights were debated and advanced. Though often restricted to middle and upper-class women, these clubs represented a step toward public life, carving out a sphere where women's voices could be heard. The suffrage movement, though still a minority cause in the 1880s, gained momentum through the efforts of leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who continued to campaign for women's right to vote even as they faced persistent opposition. Their advocacy, often met with ridicule or dismissal, reflected the slow pace of change, yet their persistence kept the issue alive in public discourse. Women's exclusion from the ballot box symbolized their broader exclusion from political power, but it also became a rallying point, drawing attention to the contradiction of a nation that celebrated democracy while silencing half its population. Education played a critical role in shaping women's opportunities in this period. While higher education for women was still limited, the founding of women's colleges such as Vassar, Wellesley, and Smith in the preceding decades had begun to create new pathways. By the 1880s, a growing number of women were entering teaching, one of the few professions considered respectable and accessible. Teaching provided not only income, but also a measure of independence, though salaries were low, and the profession was still governed by rules that reinforced traditional gender expectations. The domestic role of women, celebrated in the ideal of the cult of true womanhood, persisted strongly throughout the 1880s. This cultural framework emphasized piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, casting women as the moral foundation of society, but confining them largely to private spaces. While this ideal was often unattainable for working class and immigrant women, whose economic realities demanded labor outside the home, it continued to shape societal expectations and limit women's opportunities. The notion that women's proper sphere was the household underpinned legal and social restrictions, from property rights to employment opportunities, ensuring that even as women worked, their contributions were undervalued and unacknowledged. Despite these constraints, women found ways to exert influence within their communities. They organized benevolent societies to aid the poor, taught literacy to immigrant children, and campaigned for public health reforms. In rural towns, women led fundraising efforts for schools and churches. In cities, they became critical voices in movements to address sanitation, clean water, and safer working conditions. Their activism, though often framed in terms of morality and domestic responsibility, represented an early form of political engagement, laying the groundwork for future reforms. The life of women in the 1880s, therefore, cannot be described solely in terms of limitation. It was also marked by endurance and subtle assertion of influence. In kitchens, fields, factories, and meeting halls, women sustained households, communities, and by extension, the broader nation. They bore the burdens of labor and expectation, but they also created networks of resilience, passed down traditions of strength, and quietly began to challenge the structures that confined them. The decade was a time of transition, where old ideals of womanhood coexisted uneasily with the realities of industrial labor, urban life, and early activism. Though equality remained distant, the rhythms of women's lives in the 1880s revealed both the persistence of traditional roles and the first visible cracks in their boundaries. The struggles of these women, often invisible in public histories, were the quiet but essential threads woven into the broader fabric of America, threads that would, in the decades to come, be pulled into larger movements for suffrage, labor reform, and greater recognition of women's rights. In the America of the 1880s, childhood unfolded in ways that were often starkly different from the sentimental images later generations would come to associate with youth. For many children, especially those born into working-class families, the 1880s were years less defined by carefree play and more by obligation, responsibility, and labor. The idea of childhood as a distinct protected stage of life was still only beginning to take shape, nurtured in small part by reformers who believed that schools rather than factories ought to occupy the days of the young. Yet for millions, the realities of work, chores, and duty left little time for formal schooling or leisure. In rural America, where the majority of children still lived, childhood was closely tied to the agricultural cycle. From a young age, boys and girls alike were expected to contribute to the household economy, not as an afterthought, but as an essential element of survival. Boys tended to livestock, fetched water, split wood, and followed their fathers into the fields during planting and harvest. Girls assisted their mothers with cooking, sewing, and caring for younger siblings, while also helping in the barnyard when needed. The work was steady and varied, and it left little distinction between childhood and adulthood beyond scale and strength. Children's smaller bodies allowed them to perform tasks in tight spaces, or with delicate hands, and this practicality meant that their labor was never wasted. Schooling, though available in many rural areas through one-room schoolhouses, often competed with the demands of farm life. Attendance fluctuated with the seasons during planting and harvest. Classrooms emptied as children joined their families in the fields. Lessons were simple and repetitive, focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral instruction. Schoolhouses were sparsely furnished, with rough wooden benches, chalkboards, and a single stove to provide warmth in winter. Teachers, often young women, managed groups of students of different ages and levels, teaching each in turn while maintaining order with little more than an authority of presence. For many children, schooling was an intermittent privilege rather than a daily guarantee, and literacy levels reflected these uneven opportunities. In towns and cities, the experiences of children varied sharply depending on class and ethnicity. Middle-class families, influenced by a growing belief in the importance of education and proper upbringing, were more likely to keep children in school, shielding them from labor as much as possible. For working-class and immigrant children, however, the realities were harsher. Factories, mills, and mines drew in thousands of children whose wages, though meager, were vital to family survival. In textile mills, small hands were used to fix threads on moving machines. In coal mines, boys as young as 8 worked as breaker boys, sitting for long hours to separate coal from stone. The conditions were dangerous, the hours long, and the risks of injury or ill health constant. The census of 1880 recorded nearly 1 out of every 6 children between the ages of 10 and 15 engaged in gainful employment. This figure, striking in its scale, does not fully capture the hidden labor of younger children in households, on farms, or in street trades. Newsboys, bootblacks, and messenger boys crowded urban streets, selling papers or shining shoes for pennies. Girls in immigrant families often worked as seamstresses, or in sweatshops, sewing garments in dimly lit rooms for endless hours. The wages were low, but in households where every cent mattered, their earnings were a necessary supplement. Play existed, though it was often woven into the fabric of work, rather than standing apart from it. Rural children made games of chores, racing each other to fetch water or turning fields into spaces of rough and tumble recreation once tasks were done. Toys were often handmade, carved from wood or pieced together from scraps of fabric. In cities, street games flourished. Stickball, marbles, and jump rope offered brief moments of freedom in crowded alleys and courtyards. Libraries and organized playgrounds were rare, and much of children's recreation was informal, fleeting, and shaped by the spaces available to them. The 1880s also marked the slow but steady growth of compulsory education laws. Massachusetts had been the first state to pass such legislation decades earlier, and by the 1880s many states were beginning to adopt similar measures. Enforcement was inconsistent, particularly in rural and immigrant-heavy areas, where the economic need for child labor outweighed the push for formal schooling. Yet reformers persisted, driven by a belief that education was essential not only for individual advancement, but also for the moral and civic health of the nation. By the end of the century, these efforts would bear more visible fruit, but in the 1880s, the tension between school and work remained unresolved. Children in wealthier households experienced a different childhood altogether. They were more likely to attend private schools or academies, their days structured by lessons, music practice, and social visits. Girls were trained in manners, needlework, and domestic arts, while boys were prepared for professional or business futures. Toys, books, and leisure were more readily available, creating a separation between their experiences and those of working-class children. This divergence underscored the class divisions of the era, where wealth could buy not only comfort, but also the very shape of childhood itself. For African American children in the South, life was shaped by the harsh realities of post-Reconstruction society. Many worked as sharecroppers' children, contributing to agricultural labor while attending poorly funded segregated schools when possible. Access to education was limited, and facilities were often inadequate, reflecting the broader system of inequality and disenfranchisement. Native American children, meanwhile, were increasingly targeted by government policies of assimilation, with institutions such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School established to strip them of language, culture, and identity. These schools removed children from their families, forbidding them to speak their native languages and imposing Euro-American customs under the guise of education. The trauma of such policies left lasting scars on communities, marking childhood with loss as much as with learning. The 1880s, then, present a picture of childhood that was far from idyllic. While reformers began to argue for the protection of children from labor and for the expansion of education, the realities of poverty, economic necessity, and social inequality ensured that many young lives were marked by hard work, danger, and limited opportunity. Childhood was less a sheltered stage of growth, and more an early entry into the responsibilities and hardships of adulthood. And yet, even within these constraints, children found ways to carve out spaces of joy and imagination. In city streets and country fields, in the corners of classrooms and in fleeting moments of rest, they created games, shared laughter, and carried forward traditions of resilience. The 1880s offered little softness to most children, but their presence was woven deeply into the fabric of family, labor, and community life, shaping the generation that would carry America into the uncertain decades to come. In the 1880s, entertainment in America was a varied tapestry, woven from both the spectacular and the simple, from the communal thrill of a traveling circus to the quiet glow of lamplight over a family Bible or a well-thumbed dime novel. It was a world in which leisure was still a luxury for many, yet even the most burdened lives sought and found small spaces of escape, where imagination and music, stories and laughter could provide a reprieve from the demands of work and survival. For rural families, entertainment was often local and rooted in the rhythms of community life. Fairs were among the most anticipated events of the year, blending agricultural competition with spectacle and festivity. County fairs showcased prize livestock, harvest displays, and new farming implements, but they also brought together neighbors from miles around, offering a rare chance for socializing. Beyond the competitions, fairs featured food stalls, games of chance, and occasionally traveling entertainers who added a sense of novelty. Music drifted from fiddlers and brass bands, while laughter rose from children exploring rows of booths. These events were not frequent, but their very scarcity lent them a sense of importance, anchoring memories of excitement in otherwise steady routines. The circus, with its bright banners and fantastical performances, held a special place in the imagination of the 1880s. Traveling shows, most famously those of P.T. Barnum, wound their way across the country by rail, bringing lions, elephants, trapeze artists, and clowns to towns both large and small. For many rural Americans, the arrival of the circus was unlike anything else they might see in their lifetime. The spectacle of exotic animals and daring acts presented a world of wonder far removed from the fields and barns of daily labor. Entire families would gather to watch parades of wagons rolling down main streets, building anticipation before the big top itself unfolded its mysteries. In the growing cities, vaudeville began to dominate the cultural landscape, a uniquely American form of variety entertainment that stitched together comedy, song, dance, acrobatics, and novelty acts. Vaudeville theaters attracted audiences of all classes, offering programs that shifted quickly from one act to the next. For immigrants, vaudeville provided not only amusement, but also an introduction to the language and rhythms of American culture, blending ethnic humor, familiar folk songs, and new popular tunes. The energy of these performances contrasted sharply with the harder edges of daily labor, giving workers a space to laugh and be astonished, if only for an evening. Music halls and saloons offered another outlet, particularly in urban neighborhoods where working men sought relief at the end of the day. These spaces often echoed with the sound of pianos, fiddles, and sing-alongs, with songs ranging from sentimental ballads to lively folk tunes. For women and children, such establishments were largely off-limits, but the culture of music extended into homes, where upright pianos became increasingly common among middle-class families. Evenings around the piano, with family members playing or singing together, became a symbol of domestic leisure and refinement. Sheet music sales flourished, and popular songs traveled quickly, binding communities through melody as much as through words. For the solitary or the imaginative, dime novels opened a door to adventure. Sold cheaply and printed in vast numbers, these small books carried stories of Western heroes, detectives, outlaws, and daring rescues. They appealed especially to young men and boys, whose limited opportunities for adventure found an outlet in tales of cowboys and frontiersmen. Critics dismissed them as lowbrow or corrupting, but their popularity testified to the hunger for stories in a nation still shaping its identity. Libraries were not yet widespread, and for many, these novels provided an accessible and affordable escape. Despite these growing forms of commercial entertainment, much of leisure in the 1880s was still rooted in the home. Evenings were illuminated not by electric lights, still rare outside of select urban districts, but by kerosene lamps or candles, casting a soft flickering glow across parlors and kitchens. Families gathered around hearths or tables, sharing stories, reading aloud from newspapers or books, and engaging in simple games like checkers or cards. The pace of these evenings was unhurried, shaped by the natural limits of light and energy after a long day's work. For many, this quiet domestic time was as meaningful as any public spectacle, knitting together family bonds in the soft silence of lamplight. Religion also provided its own rhythms of entertainment and community gathering. Church socials, choir rehearsals, and holiday pageants blended devotion with festivity, offering both spiritual sustenance and social interaction. Seasonal events such as Christmas gatherings or 4th of July celebrations punctuated the year with moments of collective joy, marked by hymns, parades, or fireworks. These occasions reminded communities of shared values, while also providing spaces for leisure distinct from daily toil. The contrast between wealth and poverty revealed itself even in leisure. The affluent attended opera performances, formal balls, and theatre productions that displayed both cultural refinement and social status. Elaborate theatres in cities like New York and Boston staged productions of Shakespeare, operas from Europe, and serious drama for audiences dressed in finery. For the wealthy, leisure was a stage upon which to display their privilege as much as to enjoy performance. Meanwhile, working-class families found their entertainment in humbler settings. Penny arcades, Nickelodeons in their earliest forms, or neighborhood gatherings. Yet both ends of the spectrum spoke to a universal desire for diversion, whether refined or simple, elaborate or humble. As the decade progressed, technological change hinted at new forms of entertainment yet to come. The phonograph, invented only a few years earlier by Thomas Edison, began to find its way into homes, allowing people to hear recorded voices and music for the first time. Though still a novelty in the 1880s, it foreshadowed a world in which sound could be captured and replayed, altering the relationship between performer and audience. Photography, too, provided entertainment of a sort, with carte de visite and family portraits offering tangible mementos of life's moments. The seeds of a media-saturated culture were present, though in forms still fragile and experimental. Entertainment in the 1880s was thus a blend of spectacle and simplicity, of communal gatherings and solitary diversions, of ancient patterns and modern innovations. The circus and vaudeville dazzled with noise and color, while the quiet glow of a kerosene lamp illuminated evenings of reading, music, or family conversation. It was a world in which the human desire for story, song, and amusement persisted despite the hardships of labor and the constraints of daily survival. The balance of work and leisure tilted heavily toward toil, yet even within that imbalance, people carved out spaces to imagine, to laugh, to sing, and to dream. The story of leisure in this decade was not one of universal access or abundance, but of resilience, a reminder that even in times of transition and struggle, people sought ways to ease the weight of life. In barns filled with fiddles, in theaters crowded with laughter, in parlors lit by lamplight, the people of the 1880s found their moments of reprieve, fleeting but meaningful, before returning once more to the demands of a world in motion. In the America of the 1880s, food was at once a necessity and a ritual, an anchor of daily life that reflected both abundance and constraint. To sit at the table in that decade was to encounter meals shaped by geography, season, and tradition, prepared with methods that required time, effort, and resourcefulness. Without the ease of refrigeration, without canned goods in wide supply beyond certain staples, and without the swift transport of perishable foods across long distances, the American diet was still profoundly local, seasonal, and tied to the labor of the household itself. For most rural families, the table bore the fruits of their own labor. Bread was baked at home, often several loaves at a time, with flour bought in bulk from local mills. Cornmeal was another staple, ground into mushes, breads and cakes that could sustain through long days in the fields. Potatoes appeared in many forms, boiled, mashed, or fried, their reliability as a crop ensuring their ubiquity. In summer months, gardens produced a variety of vegetables, beans, cabbages, onions, squash, and turnips, preserved for the colder months by drying, pickling, or storing in root cellars. Orchards contributed apples and pears, which could be eaten fresh in season, or turned into cider, vinegar, or preserved in jars. The rhythm of meals followed the rhythm of the land. What grew nearby determined what was served, and what could be kept against the winter months dictated how diets shifted with the seasons. Meat was consumed regularly, but not always in great variety. Pork, in particular, was central in much of the country, as pigs could be raised and slaughtered locally, their meat salted or smoked to last through the year. Ham, bacon, and salt pork appeared frequently, lending flavor to otherwise plain meals. Beef was less common on small farms unless a cow was slaughtered, but cities and towns had growing access to butcher shops supplied by rail. Chickens provided both meat and eggs, the latter a vital source of protein and fat for many families. Hunting and fishing supplemented diets in rural areas, with venison, rabbit, or trout offering welcome changes in flavor. Preservation remained crucial, as fresh meat would spoil quickly, especially in the humid heat of summer. Smoking houses, salting barrels, and canning jars were all part of the landscape of food security. Dairy products played a significant role in the American diet of the 1880s. Though their availability varied by region and season, milk, butter, and cheese were produced in farm households, with women and children often responsible for the labor of churning and curdling. In towns and cities, milkmen delivered fresh milk. Though without refrigeration, contamination was common, and the quality of milk varied. Butter churns were familiar fixtures in households, and homemade butter was a point of pride, both for its taste and for the work invested in its production. Cheese, while not always as varied as in Europe, was increasingly produced in regional creameries, finding its way into both farm and town kitchens. Sugar, though widely available, was used with restraint, as it remained expensive compared to other staples. Molasses, sorghum syrup, and honey, often substituted, lending sweetness to biscuits, cornbread, or porridge. Coffee had become a national habit by the 1880s, brewed daily in most households, though often boiled to a bitterness modern palates would find harsh. Tea remained common, especially among immigrant communities, and in more urban households. Alcohol, too, was a regular presence, with cider, beer and whiskey produced locally and consumed with meals or in social gatherings. Temperance movements were gaining strength in this period, but alcohol's place at the table was still firm in many regions. In cities, the story of food took on a different cast. Local markets were the lifeblood of urban diets, supplying meat, vegetables, bread and dairy to families who did not have land or gardens of their own. Butchers, bakers, fishmongers and grocers lined city streets, their wares displayed in open stalls or behind counters. Without refrigeration, freshness was paramount, and shopping often occurred daily, particularly for perishable items. Tenement families in overcrowded districts faced a harsher reality, with limited access to fresh food and reliance on cheap cuts of meat, day-old bread, and whatever vegetables could be afforded. Street vendors offered roasted peanuts, oysters, or baked goods, sustaining the poor as much as they provided treats to children. The act of preparing food in the 1880s was labor-intensive and central to household life. Stoves, fueled by wood or coal, stood at the center of kitchens, producing both meals and the heat that warmed homes. Cooking required planning and skill, as temperatures could not be finely controlled, and ingredients had to be measured by experience rather than precise tools. Women, and often daughters, bore the responsibility for this work, rising early to prepare breakfasts of porridge, bread, or fried meats before the day's labor began. Lunches might be simple, bread and cold meat, packed for field workers or laborers, while suppers provided heartier fare, with stews, roasted vegetables, or pies, making use of what was at hand. Taking, preserving and churning filled afternoons, turning kitchens into sites of constant activity, especially during harvest seasons when food had to be prepared for long-term storage. Refrigeration, in its modern sense, was absent. Ice boxes, lined with tin or zinc and cooled with blocks of ice, represented the height of domestic convenience in households that could afford them. Ice was harvested in winter from frozen rivers and lakes, stored in insulated ice houses, and delivered to urban homes by icemen, who cut blocks to fit household containers. Yet for many families, especially in rural areas, food preservation depended on older methods: salting, smoking, drying or cellaring. These practices defined not only what was eaten, but also how meals tasted, with heavily salted or smoked foods forming an inescapable part of the culinary landscape. Dining customs reflected social norms and family structures. In rural homes, meals were hearty and simple, eaten together at large wooden tables, with portions determined by age, labor, and gender. Men who worked long hours in the fields were served first and in larger amounts, while children and women often ate after. In more affluent urban households, dining took on greater ceremony, with courses served in sequence, table linens laid out, and imported goods such as spices, wines, or fine cuts of meat, signaling wealth and refinement. Restaurants, though not yet the widespread institutions they would later become, existed in cities, catering to businessmen, travelers, and the wealthy. For the working class, cheap eateries and lunchrooms provided filling if plain meals of stews, bread and coffee. Food in the 1880s was therefore as much about labor and survival as it was about pleasure. Every meal was a reminder of the effort required to produce it: the ploughing and harvesting, the churning and baking, the cutting and salting. Yet within this effort, there was also community and culture. Families gathered around shared tables, neighbors exchanged recipes, and immigrant groups brought new flavors to American cities. German immigrants popularized sausages and beer. Italians introduced pasta and tomato dishes, and Chinese immigrants brought rice and stir-fried meals to Western towns. These exchanges enriched the American table, even as resistance to foreign foods sometimes accompanied broader anxieties about immigration. By the close of the decade, the American table was at once traditional and transitional. Old patterns of self-sufficiency and local reliance persisted, but the beginnings of national food networks, powered by railroads and industry, were visible. Canned goods such as tomatoes, corn and peaches appeared more often, their long shelf lives offering new possibilities for meals. Packaged foods, like crackers and cereals, began their slow rise. The simplicity of the farm table and the bustle of the city market coexisted uneasily with the first signs of mass production and standardization that would soon transform the way Americans ate. To eat in the 1880s was to encounter a diet shaped by effort, geography, and seasonality, flavored by smoke, salt, and simplicity. It was to inhabit a world where food meant labor, where freshness was fleeting, and where the rhythms of meals bound together families, neighbors, and communities in the shared act of sustaining life. The American table of this decade may seem plain by modern standards, but it held within it the essence of a nation in transition, grounded in the soil, dependent on tradition, yet slowly reaching toward a future of change. In the America of the 1880s, health was fragile, medicine uncertain, and disease a constant shadow that shaped the rhythm of life. To live in this decade was to inhabit a world where the human body remained vulnerable to ailments that modern science has since subdued, and where care, though increasingly professionalized, was still as likely to be found in the home of a midwife or the quiet ministrations of family as in the corridors of hospitals. The science of medicine was slowly advancing, yet for most Americans, health remained precarious, tied to circumstance, sanitation, and chance. Illness was a frequent visitor in both city and countryside. In the crowded tenements of industrial centers, tuberculosis spread easily, the damp walls and unventilated rooms providing perfect breeding grounds for disease. Cholera, smallpox, and typhoid fever appeared in waves, carried by contaminated water and poor sanitation, striking hardest among the poor, who had the least protection. Cities struggled with sewage systems that were often incomplete, and water supplies that were unreliable or tainted. In rural areas, isolation could offer protection from epidemics, yet the absence of nearby doctors meant that even minor illnesses could prove dangerous if left unchecked. Medical practice in the 1880s stood at a threshold between older traditions and newer sciences. The germ theory of disease, developed in Europe by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, was beginning to take hold in the medical community, though it was not yet universally accepted in America. Some physicians embraced the idea that invisible organisms caused illness, while others continued to rely on older models of imbalance and miasma. As a result, treatments varied widely, from disinfectants and antiseptics in progressive hospitals to herbal remedies and bloodletting in more traditional practices. Medicine remained uneven, its effectiveness often depending on the training and outlook of individual practitioners. Hospitals existed, but they were not the first recourse for most families. For much of the population, especially outside large cities, the sick were cared for at home. Hospitals were associated with charity, with poverty, and with the gravely ill who could not be treated elsewhere. In cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, institutions like Bellevue or Massachusetts General provided care, research, and teaching for doctors, but conditions could be grim, with limited resources and high mortality rates. The rise of nursing, shaped in part by figures like Florence Nightingale, was slowly improving hospital conditions, but the idea of the hospital as a place for healing rather than simply housing the sick was still evolving. Midwives played a crucial role in the medical landscape, particularly in childbirth, which was one of the most dangerous experiences in a woman's life. Maternal and infant mortality rates were high, and professional doctors often clashed with midwives, seeking to assert authority over women's care. Yet in rural communities and immigrant neighborhoods, midwives remained trusted figures, drawing on experience and tradition to guide births and care for new mothers. Their presence was a reminder of the persistence of older, community-based models of health that existed alongside the rising authority of professional medicine. Pharmacies, or apothecaries, were common in towns and cities, supplying medicines that ranged from useful compounds like quinine for malaria to patent medicines of dubious value. The 1880s were the height of the patent medicine era, when brightly labeled bottles promised cures for every ailment, tonics, elixirs, and bitters that contained alcohol, opium, or cocaine, freely sold without regulation. These remedies, advertised in newspapers and almanacs, were both relied upon and criticized, offering comfort and hope even as they sometimes deepened dependency or masked symptoms without curing them. The Pure Food and Drug Act, that would later regulate such medicines was still decades away, and so the American household often stocked its shelves with bottles whose ingredients were as mysterious as the illnesses they claimed to cure. Epidemics remained a defining feature of public health. Smallpox vaccination had been known for decades, but acceptance was uneven, and outbreaks still occurred. Yellow fever had struck the South in previous decades, and though less frequent in the 1880s, the memory of its devastation lingered. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, haunted American life, striking across classes, its slow-wasting symptoms both feared and romanticized in culture. Sanatoriums began to appear, offering fresh air, rest, and regimented routines as treatment, reflecting the limited but growing understanding of how environment and lifestyle might influence disease. Sanitation reform became an increasingly important part of urban governance in the 1880s. The growth of sewer systems, the introduction of water treatment, and the campaigns against filth and overcrowding were part of a broader movement toward public health. Reformers pushed for cleaner streets, stricter inspections, and education about hygiene, yet progress was uneven, and many neighborhoods remained vulnerable. In immigrant districts, where poverty was deepest, disease struck hardest, reinforcing social prejudice and fueling debates about health and morality. Mental health, too, had its place in the medical world of the 1880s, though often in grim circumstances. Asylums existed in cities and states, housing those deemed insane or unfit for society. Conditions varied, from reform-minded institutions seeking to provide rest and order to overcrowded facilities, where neglect and abuse were common. Treatments included rest cures, moral therapy, and in some cases experimental procedures, reflecting the uncertain state of psychiatric knowledge. The very idea of mental illness was entangled with social and cultural judgments, and those who entered asylums often found themselves confined for years regardless of recovery. Daily healthcare, however, remained centered in the home. Mothers learned to treat fevers, coughs, and wounds with herbal teas, poultices, and folk remedies passed down through generations. Alcohol was often used as a disinfectant and pain reliever, while whiskey or brandy might be administered for shock. The boundary between medicine and household management was porous, and survival often depended on the resilience and knowledge of families rather than on access to professional doctors. Life expectancy in the 1880s was significantly lower than in later decades, averaging around 40 years for men and slightly higher for women. Infant mortality remained heartbreakingly high, with many families losing children in their first years. Yet within this fragility, there was resilience. Communities rallied around the sick, neighbors shared remedies, and the slow spread of medical science began to offer new tools against old enemies. The decade witnessed the beginnings of antiseptic surgery, the cautious use of anesthesia, and the first stirrings of bacteriology as a guiding principle. These advances, though not yet widespread, pointed toward a future where disease would be less omnipresent and medicine more reliable. To live with health and medicine in the 1880s was to inhabit a world of uncertainty, where hope mingled with risk, and where the line between life and death was often narrow. It was a world shaped by midwives and patent medicines, by epidemics and reformers, by hospitals that offered both promise and peril. The human body was vulnerable, but communities adapted, endured, and carried forward traditions of care that sustained them through illness. And as the century inched closer to its close, the fragile balance between disease and medicine began slowly, almost imperceptibly, to tip in favor of science. The 1880s in America unfolded in a curious balance between the familiar rhythms of older traditions and the gradual intrusion of new technologies that would soon redefine daily life. For most people, the decade still belonged to the horse, the kerosene lamp, and the handwritten letter. Yet in scattered towns, cities, and even within the quiet halls of certain homes, the faint buzz of electricity, the metallic ring of a telephone, and the presence of new machines hinted at a future that was beginning to take shape. Technology in this era was neither evenly distributed nor universally trusted, but it was steadily weaving its way into the fabric of American existence, foreshadowing the profound transformations that would characterize the coming century. Electricity, perhaps more than anything else, symbolized this slow arrival of modernity. In 1879, Thomas Edison had perfected the incandescent light bulb, and by the early 1880s his company was installing lighting systems in parts of New York City. The Pearl Street Station, one of the first central power plants, began operating in 1882, providing electric light to a small section of Lower Manhattan. For those who experienced it, the shift was remarkable. Gas lamps, with their hiss and soot, gave way to steady electric light that seemed almost magical in its clarity and reliability. Yet, electricity remained rare, a curiosity of cities and the wealthy. Most Americans continued to live by candle and kerosene, their evenings dim and flickering, while only a small minority glimpsed the brighter future ahead. The telephone followed a similar path, at once revolutionary and limited. Alexander Graham Bell had patented his device in 1876, and by the 1880s telephone lines were spreading into urban areas, linking businesses, hotels, and a handful of private residences. In cities like Boston and Chicago, switchboard operators became familiar figures, manually connecting calls and managing the web of communication. For many, the idea of speaking across distance was astonishing, yet access was restricted by cost and infrastructure. Rural communities remained reliant on the postal service, which delivered letters, newspapers, and catalogs that kept them tied to the wider world. For them, the telephone was a distant rumor of a device that belonged to wealthier circles. Beyond electricity and telephony, the 1880s saw an ongoing wave of inventions that spoke to the restless spirit of innovation in America. The typewriter, refined and commercialized in the preceding decade, was transforming offices, allowing clerks and stenographers to produce neat, uniform documents far faster than handwriting had permitted. The sewing machine, though already present for decades, continued to spread, enabling families and businesses to create clothing with greater efficiency. In 1885, Carl Benz in Germany introduced the first practical automobile powered by an internal combustion engine, though such machines would not appear in America for some years. Even the bicycle, with its evolving designs, was beginning to make its presence felt, offering mobility and independence, particularly to young men in urban centers. Railroads, too, were undergoing technological refinement. By the 1880s, the great transcontinental connections were already in place, but improvements in steel rails, couplers, and brakes made travel faster and somewhat safer. The telegraph remained the nervous system of the railroads, coordinating schedules and reducing collisions, though accidents were still common. For passengers, train journeys offered a glimpse of modern convenience, dining cars, sleeping cars, and the possibility of crossing vast distances in days rather than months. Yet, even here the experience varied: luxury for the wealthy in plush compartments, and hard benches for the poor, who endured long rides in cramped cars. Agricultural technology also shifted subtly in this decade, though not with the same dramatic impact as urban innovations. Mechanical reapers, seed drills, and threshing machines had already altered the scale of farming, enabling single families to cultivate more land than ever before. Yet, the reliance on animal power and manual labor remained heavy. Steam-powered tractors and machinery existed, but were costly and impractical for many farmers, particularly in the scattered homesteads of the West. As a result, the daily rhythm of plowing, planting, and harvesting still depended largely on physical exertion, though the promise of mechanization loomed in the near future. Households saw gradual changes in domestic technology as well. Ice boxes, relying on blocks of ice delivered from local suppliers, allowed families to preserve food slightly longer, though true refrigeration was still decades away. Cast iron stoves, fueled by wood or coal, were common in kitchens, replacing open hearths and making cooking somewhat more manageable. The sewing machine, the butter churn, and hand-cranked washing devices eased, though never eliminated, the heavy burden of domestic labor. Each invention chipped away at time-consuming tasks, yet the vision of effortless modern living remained distant, confined to advertisements and exhibitions rather than daily reality. World's fairs and expositions in this era played an important role in introducing Americans to technological marvels. The 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, though a few years before the 1880s, had unveiled wonders like the telephone and the Corliss steam engine, inspiring awe and curiosity. Throughout the decade, Smaller fairs and exhibitions continued to showcase machines, electrical displays and industrial products, inviting ordinary citizens to imagine futures that were not yet theirs. These public spectacles served as bridges between innovation and everyday life, even as adoption lagged behind. Yet technology in the 1880s was not merely a matter of invention and machinery, it was also a matter of perception. Many Americans regarded electricity with suspicion, fearing shocks, fires, or unseen dangers. The telephone, while fascinating, was seen by some as unnecessary or intrusive. Machines could inspire wonder, but they could also provoke unease, as laborers worried about job loss, or farmers feared debt from purchasing costly equipment. Technology promised progress, but it also unsettled established patterns, forcing individuals and communities to reconcile the familiar with the unfamiliar. The decade closed with a sense of anticipation. By 1889, when the new century was only a decade away, the outlines of modern life were visible, but not yet universal. Electric streetlights illuminated sections of New York and Chicago, but vast rural stretches still lived by starlight and lamp. The telephone linked offices in city blocks, but most Americans relied on pen and paper. Factories ran on steam and human effort, though whispers of electricity and mechanization suggested greater transformations ahead. The nation stood at a threshold, straddling two ages, its daily life anchored in the old but leaning cautiously toward the new. In this way, technology in the 1880s was less about ubiquity than about promise. It hinted at futures of brightness, speed and connection, futures that would unfold in the decades to come. For those who lived then, it was a time of glimpses of what was possible, glimpses of what might come, glimpses of a century that would soon arrive carrying machines and wonders that could scarcely yet be imagined. In the 1880s, religion remained one of the most powerful threads binding together communities across America, shaping not only private devotion, but also public life, moral codes, and the quiet rhythms of the week. Although the nation was rapidly changing, with factories rising, railroads spreading, and immigration transforming cities, the presence of churches and the sound of Sunday bells still anchored much of daily experience. In rural towns, on frontier homesteads, and even in crowded city neighborhoods, religion served as both a personal solace and a communal center, offering structure and identity in a time of transition. Most Americans in the 1880s identified as Christians, though denominations varied widely depending on region, ethnicity, and cultural tradition. Protestantism was dominant, encompassing Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Congregationalists, and others. Methodists and Baptists, in particular, flourished in the rural South and Midwest, where their emphasis on personal faith and revival-style preaching resonated with scattered farming communities. Catholicism grew rapidly during this decade, as immigration from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe swelled urban populations, leading to the construction of parishes that often doubled as cultural and social hubs. Smaller groups, such as Jews, Quakers, and members of new religious movements like the Mormons, also shaped distinct communities, though often facing prejudice or marginalization. The centrality of Sunday was perhaps the most visible expression of religious life. For most Americans, Sunday was set apart, a day when fields lay idle, shops closed, and factories slowed their machines. Families prepared themselves carefully, donning clothing reserved for church and walking or riding into town. Services were often long, sometimes lasting several hours, filled with hymns, scripture readings and sermons that touched upon both spiritual salvation and worldly concerns. Beyond worship, Sunday gatherings created opportunities for fellowship, for neighbors to exchange news, for children to play together, and for communities to reaffirm bonds that daily toil might otherwise weaken. In towns and villages, the church building was often the most prominent structure, situated on a central street or square. Its steeple might be visible for miles, a landmark rising above barns and houses, signaling both faith and community. Inside, wooden pews, simple pulpits and oil lamps created an atmosphere of solemnity, though wealthier congregations might have stained glass or even early organs. For smaller frontier settlements, services were sometimes held in schoolhouses, barns or open fields, led by circuit preachers who traveled on horseback from place to place, carrying the message of faith to scattered populations. Religion in this era was not confined to worship, but extended into moral codes that govern daily life. In many communities, strict standards shaped behavior. Alcohol was condemned by growing temperance movements, gambling was frowned upon, and adherence to modesty in dress and conduct was expected. Churches often enforced these expectations, serving as guardians of social order as much as spiritual shepherds. For young people, moral instruction intertwined with education, as Sunday schools grew in popularity, teaching not only Bible stories but also literacy and discipline. Immigrant communities carried their faiths with them, and in crowded neighborhoods, religion helped preserve identity and continuity amid dislocation. Catholic parishes in cities like New York and Chicago offered services in multiple languages: Irish, German, Polish, Italian, ensuring that newcomers could worship in familiar ways. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe built synagogues, often modest at first, which became centers of both worship and cultural preservation. Religious festivals and rituals reinforced a sense of belonging, providing continuity between old homelands and the new unfamiliar world of America. The 1880s were also a time of growing evangelical fervor and reform-minded activism. Revival meetings, sometimes held in tents or open-air gatherings, drew crowds who sought renewed faith or dramatic conversion experiences. Evangelists like Dwight L. Moody gained prominence, spreading messages that combined personal salvation with calls for moral reform. The social gospel movement, emerging in Protestant circles, emphasized addressing poverty, inequality, and injustice as expressions of Christian duty, laying foundations for later progressive reforms. Religion thus shaped not only private morality, but also public debates, influencing movements against child labor, for education, and for better working conditions. Women played an especially active role in religious and community life during this decade. Though excluded from formal leadership in most denominations, they organized church groups, taught Sunday schools, and spearheaded reform initiatives such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which campaigned against alcohol while also promoting women's greater public involvement. These efforts blurred the lines between religion, morality, and emerging activism, allowing women to exert influence in shaping communities, even within the constraints of traditional gender roles. On the frontier, where isolation could weigh heavily on families, religious gatherings provided vital relief from loneliness. A traveling preacher's visit might draw settlers from miles around, turning the occasion into both a spiritual event and a social gathering. Camp meetings, with preaching, singing, and communal meals, offered opportunities for connection, reinforcing bonds among scattered families. In such settings, religion was less about rigid ritual and more about sustaining hope, discipline, and solidarity in environments that tested endurance. Religion also shaped responses to the broader transformations of the age. For some, rapid industrialization and urbanization raised concerns about moral decay, leading preachers to warn against the dangers of greed, vice, and neglect of family life. For others, science and modernity posed new questions. The debate sparked by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in the mid-19th century, echoed into the 1880s, with some embracing the compatibility of faith and science, while others rejected it as a challenge to biblical truth. These tensions highlighted the ways religion interacted with, and sometimes resisted, the shifts of the modern world. At its heart, however, religion in the 1880s was about stability, in a decade marked by economic cycles of boom and bust, by immigration that transformed cities, and by technological changes that unsettled daily rhythms. Faith remained a constant, or whether through the solemnity of Sunday services, the joy of shared hymns, or the quiet rituals of prayer and scripture at home. Religion provided Americans with a framework for understanding their lives and the world around them. As the decade moved toward its end, churches remained full, Sunday schools continued to grow, and moral codes still shaped community expectations. Yet the seeds of change were visible. Religious pluralism was expanding with immigration. Women were pushing for greater influence through reform movements, and new interpretations of Christianity were linking faith with social justice. The America of the 1880s thus lived within traditions of belief that were centuries old, while also beginning to adapt those traditions to a society that was itself in transition. religion and community life in this era were not just about worship, they were about belonging, continuity and shared meaning. They bound people to one another, reminded them of duty, and carried them through the uncertainties of a rapidly changing nation. In this way, the churches, synagogues and meeting houses of the 1880s were not merely buildings but pillars, standing steady as the country shifted, steady as the old century waned and a new one approached. In the 1880s, politics in America carried an air of both great importance and deep disillusionment. On one hand, the structures of government were firmly in place, the Constitution nearly a century old, and the Union preserved after the brutal test of the Civil War. On the other, the politics of the era were marred by corruption, factionalism, and the heavy influence of money, as industrialists and railroad barons loomed large over elected officials. Historians later labeled these decades the Gilded Age, borrowing a phrase from Mark Twain, who used it to describe a society that glittered on the surface while hiding layers of decay and inequity beneath. For ordinary Americans, the workings of politics often seemed distant, shaped less by noble ideals than by the exchange of favors, party loyalty, and the calculations of men who viewed government as another avenue for profit. The decade was marked by a string of presidents whose names are often forgotten or overshadowed in the sweep of history, yet who each presided over moments that revealed the tensions of the time. At the dawn of the 1880s, Rutherford B. Hayes was finishing his single term, chosen as a compromise candidate after the contested election of 1876. Hayes embodied a quieter kind of leadership. He oversaw the final withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and leaving African Americans to face the rise of segregation and Jim Crow without the protection of federal authority. His presidency revealed how compromise often defined the age. Peace was maintained, but at a cost borne by those with the least power. In 1880, James A. Garfield, a former Union general and Republican congressman from Ohio, was elected president. His tenure was brief, lasting only a matter of months before he was struck down by an assassin's bullet in July 1881. Garfield's death, lingering for weeks due to medical mismanagement, became one of the defining tragedies of the decade. It underscored both the vulnerability of leaders and the need for reform in a political culture where patronage and personal ambition dominated. His assassin, Charles Guiteau, claimed he had been denied a government post he believed he deserved, highlighting how deeply the spoils system of political appointments had embedded itself into national life. Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur, was an unlikely reformer, known previously as a product of the political machine in New York. Arthur surprised many by supporting civil service reform, helping to pass the Pendleton Act of 1883. This law marked the first real attempt to break the stranglehold of patronage, requiring certain government jobs to be filled by merit rather than political loyalty. It was a modest beginning, but it hinted at the possibility of change within a system long dominated by party bosses and corruption. Arthur's presidency remains little celebrated, yet his turn toward reform revealed how even figures shaped by the machine could, under the right circumstances, step beyond it. The election of 1884 brought Grover Cleveland, a Democrat from New York, to the White House. His victory was narrow and bitterly contested, but it reflected a hunger among some Americans for honesty in government. Cleveland cultivated a reputation as a reformer, known for his willingness to veto bills he considered wasteful, earning him the nickname Veto President. He stood apart in his refusal to indulge in the same degree of patronage that many predecessors embraced. His administration sought to reduce tariffs and promote fiscal responsibility, though he also faced criticism for his limited vision, particularly in dealing with labor unrest and the plight of farmers. Still, his election showed that even in an age dominated by cynicism, there was room for leaders who tried to bring integrity into the system. Throughout the 1880s, political life was not confined to the actions of presidents alone. Congress remained a powerful arena, where party divisions between Republicans and Democrats were fierce, but often centered more on patronage networks and regional loyalties than on broad ideological visions. Republicans dominated the North, appealing to industrialists, veterans, and reformers, while Democrats held sway in the South and among many immigrant communities and cities. The balance of power shifted back and forth, ensuring that neither party could fully impose its will, and leading to a politics of stalemate and compromise. The influence of money was inescapable. Railroad companies, steel magnates, and banking interests poured resources into lobbying and campaign contributions, ensuring their priorities carried weight in Washington. Political machines in cities, such as Tammany Hall in New York, held enormous sway over urban politics, dispensing jobs, favors, and relief in exchange for loyalty at the ballot box. For immigrants struggling to survive in crowded tenements, the machine could feel like a lifeline, but it also perpetuated cycles of corruption and control. Democracy remained robust in form. Elections were frequent, turnout was high, and newspapers bristled with political commentary. Yet the substance often felt hollowed out, with decisions shaped behind closed doors rather than in open debate. This was also an era when politics intersected uneasily with the struggles of labor. Strikes erupted with increasing frequency as workers in railroads, steel mills, and coal mines protested long hours, unsafe conditions, and low pay. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had left deep scars, and in the 1880s, unrest continued with events like the Haymarket Affair of 1886 in Chicago, when a labor protest ended in violence and bomb blasts that shocked the nation. While these were not directly presidential events, they revealed how industrialization was testing the capacity of the political system. Government, more often than not, sided with business, sending troops to suppress strikes and leaving workers to feel that politics served the wealthy far more than the common man. Even as corruption flourished, Americans remained deeply invested in politics as a civic ritual. Voter turnout in the 1880s regularly exceeded 70 or even 80% of eligible voters, a figure unmatched in later decades. Elections were spectacles, complete with torchlight parades, rallies, and songs, with loyalty to party often passed down like inheritance within families. Political identity was as much about belonging and tradition as it was about issues, binding communities together even when the outcomes felt predetermined. By the end of the decade, the currents of change were visible, but not yet dominant. The seeds of reform had been planted through the Pendleton Act and through growing voices calling for regulation of railroads and monopolies. Farmers, struggling under debt and declining crop prices, were beginning to organize through alliances that would evolve into the populist movement. Workers pressed for recognition of unions and fairer treatment. Women's suffrage activists continued to push, though still decades away from victory. Politics in the 1880s remained bound to the patterns of the Gilded Age, glittering wealth, entrenched corruption, and a focus on patronage, but the pressure for something new was slowly building. The story of politics in the 1880s is not one of dramatic transformation but of uneasy continuity. Presidents came and went, some remembered for reform, others for tragedy, but none able to fully reshape a system so deeply entwined with money and influence. And yet within that system, ordinary Americans participated with remarkable passion, believing still that the act of voting, the rituals of democracy, and the hope for honest leadership might, in time, make the nation better. Politics in this decade mirrored America itself, imperfect, often unjust, yet always alive with the possibility of renewal. The 1880s in America were years when wealth took on shapes so vast and towering that ordinary people could scarcely imagine them, even as they lived each day within sight of grinding poverty. This was the Gilded Age in its truest form, a time when fortunes were amassed with a speed and scale never before witnessed in the country, and when the distance between those who had everything and those who had nothing grew wider with each passing year. The men who stood at the pinnacle of this new economy became known as industrial titans to some and robber barons to others. Their names, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, came to symbolize the immense power of private capital, and yet for millions of Americans in fields, factories, and mines, life was marked, not by abundance but by struggle. Their daily existence lived in the shadow of wealth they would never share. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few was driven by the rapid industrialization of the age. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel mills turned riversides into forests of smokestacks, oil refineries illuminated cities, and banks provided the capital to tie it all together. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil dominated petroleum. controlling not only production but transportation and refining, eliminating rivals through aggressive business practices. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant turned steel magnate, built an empire of furnaces and mills that supplied the raw material for skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt's heirs maintained their grip on the railroads, while J.P. Morgan, the financier, wielded power not through factories but through the invisible yet potent force of capital, merging companies and stabilizing markets. These men accumulated wealth on a scale previously inconceivable, with mansions, private railcars, and influence that extended into the highest levels of government. For the ordinary worker, however, the story was starkly different. Wages were meager, hours were long, and conditions in factories and mines were frequently dangerous. Children as young as 10 labored in textile mills, their hands nimble enough for the spinning machines, while men inhaled coal dust or risked injury in steel foundries where molten iron glowed in the darkness. Women often found employment as seamstresses, servants, or in sweatshops where work was endless and pay barely sufficient for survival. In the booming industrial cities, families crowded into tenements where rents consumed their incomes, leaving little for food or clothing. Diseases flourished in these cramped quarters, where sanitation was poor and access to medical care limited. The wealth of the few contrasted so painfully with the poverty of the many that newspapers of the time, reformers and preachers, all began to question whether the nation's prosperity was truly shared. Yet the inequalities were not only financial, they were also cultural and visible in the very landscapes of city and countryside. Along the broad avenues of New York and Chicago, gilded mansions rose, filled with imported art, chandeliers, and grand dining halls. These homes were showcases of extravagance, where the wealthy entertained with lavish banquets and orchestras. At the same time, only blocks away, the poor lined up for bread or lived 6 to a room in damp and crumbling apartments. The proximity of wealth and poverty was so close that the contrasts became impossible to ignore. Even those who celebrated the rise of great fortunes recognized the bitterness it created among the laboring classes, who saw little improvement in their own lives despite the boom in industry and commerce. The rise of social Darwinism provided a justification for the inequalities of the era, influenced by misapplications of Charles Darwin's theories. Some argued that the wealthy had risen to prominence because they were the fittest in a natural struggle, while the poor were destined to remain at the bottom due to laziness or incapacity. This ideology was promoted by figures like Herbert Spencer and found receptive audiences among industrialists who saw their success as evidence of their superiority. At the same time, thinkers like Andrew Carnegie sought to soften the harshness of inequality with the gospel of wealth, the belief that the rich had a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the public good. Carnegie himself endowed libraries, universities, and cultural institutions, though even such philanthropy did little to relieve the immediate suffering of the poor. The inequalities of the 1880s were also visible in rural America, where farmers, though not destitute, increasingly found themselves trapped in cycles of debt. Crop prices fell in the face of global competition, and the cost of equipment and rail shipping often left farmers with little profit. Many mortgaged their land to make ends meet, fearing foreclosure if the weather turned against them or markets declined further. The farmer, once celebrated as the backbone of the republic, found himself vulnerable and frustrated, his hardships overlooked while railroads and banks seemed to thrive. Out of this frustration grew alliances and organizations that later formed the foundation of the populist movement, an effort to challenge the economic dominance of the wealthy elite. Even within the working poor, there were divisions that reflected broader inequalities in society. Immigrants often accepted the lowest-paying jobs, competing with native-born laborers and fueling resentment. African Americans in the South, trapped by sharecropping and segregation, lived lives of toil with little hope of advancement. Native Americans on reservations faced poverty, imposed by government policy. The economic divide overlapped with racial and ethnic inequalities, ensuring that wealth and privilege were not only concentrated in certain classes, but also largely within particular groups. The American promise of opportunity seemed unevenly distributed, even as the nation continued to tell itself the story of upward mobility. Despite the gulf between rich and poor, the decade was not entirely devoid of attempts to bridge it. Labor unions began to grow, with organizations like the Knights of Labor advocating for fair wages, shorter hours, and better conditions. Strikes and protests were often met with hostility, sometimes even violence, but they revealed that workers were unwilling to accept inequality in silence. Reformers, journalists, and clergy began to shine light on the excesses of the age, documenting the plight of the poor and calling for measures to reduce suffering. Though these efforts were limited in immediate impact, they planted seeds that would grow into stronger reform movements in the decades to follow. The 1880s, then, stand as a decade when the inequalities of wealth were perhaps more visible than at any other time in American history. To the glitter of the mansions, the glow of electric lights in the homes of the wealthy, and the hum of private carriages, all shone against the darker backdrop of poverty, labor unrest, and quiet despair. It was a decade of contrasts, where opportunity and abundance existed, but where they were held by the few while the many labored simply to endure. The image of America as a land of prosperity was not false, but it was incomplete, for beneath the gilded surface lay lives marked by hardship and inequity. As the 1880s faded into memory and the final years of the century approached, America stood in a place both uncertain and inevitable, balanced between a fading world of fields and hand tools and the restless hum of machines that would soon dominate nearly every aspect of life. It had been a decade of quiet but unmistakable transition, one in which the echoes of the Civil War still lingered in the South, even as the smoke of steel mills rose higher into the skies of northern cities. The rhythms of the old rural world continued, with farmers rising before dawn to hitch plows to weary horses, women tending fires and spinning domestic life out of small acts repeated endlessly, and children walking dirt roads to schoolhouses, where learning was often as much about discipline as about knowledge. Yet alongside those familiar scenes, something larger and more restless was moving forward, railroads spreading like veins of iron, factories humming with ceaseless labor, and fortunes accumulating in the hands of men whose names would come to define the century. The decade revealed the contrasts of America more clearly than ever before. For some, it was a time of opportunity, of inventions flickering into existence and ideas expanding horizons, from electric light to the telephone, from vaudeville theaters to the quiet reach of dime novels passed hand to hand. For others, it was a time of toil and frustration, where the promise of freedom or prosperity was overshadowed by sharecropping, discrimination, or endless hours in the dim light of mines and mills. The gulf between rich and poor, between city and countryside, between the rooted and the restless, seemed vast, and yet all these lives together formed the mosaic of the nation. The very struggles of the decade, the fight of laborers for fair treatment, the quiet resistance of native communities against erasure, the organizing of farmers into alliances, the determined voices of women pressing for recognition, all spoke to a society in motion, a place where tensions coexisted with aspirations. The 1880s also carried with them a sense of inevitability, as though a new century was waiting impatiently just beyond the horizon. The old barns and wooden churches of rural towns still held sway, but electric lights were appearing on city streets. The telegraph wires stretched across plains, soon to be joined by telephones connecting voices across miles. Steamships carried immigrants by the thousands into crowded harbors, reshaping neighborhoods and futures with their languages, foods, and traditions. America was becoming a place larger than any single story could capture, defined not only by its geography, but by the lives of millions who were drawn into its promise, whether freely or under constraint. By the close of the decade, the outlines of modern America could already be seen. The seeds of reform had been planted in workers' protests, in the voices of women asking for the vote, in the demands of farmers for fairness. The outlines of power were visible in the mansions of the wealthy, the towers of banks, and the smoke of factories rising against the sky. And beneath it all, the quiet persistence of ordinary life remained. Families gathered at tables to share bread and stew, neighbors meeting at Sunday services, children playing in dusty streets or meadows, unaware that they were living in a decade that historians would later see as a bridge between two worlds. The 1880s were not a time of great battles or singular wars, not a decade of sudden revolutions, but rather of transitions that shaped the everyday fabric of life. It was a period where the past had not yet fully loosened its grip, and the future had not yet fully taken hold. A place where oxen still plowed fields in some corners, even as streetcars rattled through cities, where kerosene lamps glowed in cabins, even as electric bulbs flickered in parlors, where the gospel was preached in wooden chapels, even as vaudeville theaters filled with laughter. It was a time both ordinary and extraordinary, not through dramatic events, but through the slow reshaping of daily existence. And so, as the 1880s gave way to the 1890s, and then to the dawn of a new century, America carried forward both its burdens and its hopes. The divisions of wealth, race, and power remained deep, yet so too did the resilience of those who endured them. The dream of opportunity remained, uneven but present, drawing millions more into its orbit. The quiet strength of communities, the persistence of workers, the restlessness of inventors, and the ambitions of the powerful together created a society in motion, caught between memory and anticipation. Looking back now, the 1880s appear as a hinged decade, a moment where the old and the new met and briefly coexisted before one inevitably overtook the other. It was a time of horses and railroads, of handwritten letters and telegraph wires, of kerosene lamps and electric bulbs, of vast farms and crowded tenements. It was America in the making, a place of contrast and contradiction, where the seeds of the 20th century were planted in the soil of the 19th. Calm, ordinary, relentless. It was life as it was lived, shaping the course of a nation preparing for the century to come.